The gunshot echoed across the Texas plains as 14-year-old Clara Sullivan stood defiantly before the crowd of bidders, her emerald eyes blazing with a fury that made grown men step back. In that dusty Galveston warehouse where human dignity was auctioned to the highest bidder, she dared to spit at the feet of the auctioneer who'd just sold another child into servitude. That's when Daniel Hayes first saw her, and in that moment, everything changed. Stay with me to discover how a childless rancher's desperate bid transformed not just two lives, but an entire community. Comment below where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. The morning sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of Galveston's waterfront district, where the stench of fish mingled with the acrid smell of unwashed bodies. Daniel Hayes pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes as he navigated the crowded streets, his boots clicking against the cobblestones still slick with morning dew. He hadn't meant to come here, hadn't meant to witness what he was about to see. He'd simply taken a wrong turn while heading to the livestock auction and now found himself in a part of the city he'd rather forget existed. The warehouse loomed before him like a monument to human misery, its red brick facade stained black with soot from nearby factories. The steady murmur of voices drew him closer, curiosity overcoming his better judgment. As he approached the entrance, a burly man with arms like tree trunks blocked his path. "You here for the auction?" the man growled, tobacco juice staining the corners of his mouth. "What auction?" Daniel asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer. "Labor contracts," the man said with a yellowed grin. "Fresh shipment came in yesterday. Orphans, mostly some runaways. Good workers if you know how to handle them." Daniel's stomach churned. He'd heard whispers of such practices, children sold into apprenticeships that were slavery in all but name. The law turned a blind eye, calling it charitable work for the destitute. He should have walked away, then should have mounted his horse and ridden back to the safety of his ranch. But something, perhaps it was Eleanor's tears from just that morning when she'd seen another pregnant woman in town, another reminder of the child they'd never have, something made him push past the guard and into the darkness beyond. The warehouse interior was a vision from hell itself. Rows of children stood on a raised platform, their faces hollow with hunger and fear. Some couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, their tiny frames swallowed by rough burlap clothing. The crowd of bidders pressed forward, examining the merchandise like cattle at market. Daniel watched in horror as a well-dressed gentleman grabbed a boy's arm, checking for muscle tone, while another forced a girl to open her mouth to inspect her teeth. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed across the space, "welcome to this morning's proceedings. As always, we guarantee these contracts are legal and binding. Each child comes with papers certifying their orphan status or parental surrender. Minimum bids start at $5 for the younger ones, $10 for those of working age." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. $5. The price of a decent meal at a restaurant in Houston. That's what these vultures valued a child's life at. The bidding began with the youngest, a boy who couldn't have seen more than 6 summers. He sold for $8 to a factory owner who boasted loudly about needing small hands for his machinery. Next came a pair of sisters, maybe 8 and 10, who clung to each other desperately as the auctioneer tried to separate them for individual sale. The crowd laughed when the younger one bit the auctioneer's assistant. They sold for $15 together to a woman who ran a laundry service. Daniel was about to leave the bile in his throat, threatening to overtake him, when a commotion erupted near the platform's end. A girl taller than the others and obviously older had just kicked one of the handlers square in the shin. The man raised his hand to strike her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood straighter, her chin lifted in defiance. "That one's trouble," someone in the crowd muttered. "Been through 3 placements already. Always runs back." "Clara Sullivan," the auctioneer announced, consulting his ledger. "Age 14, Irish stock. Can read, write, and figure numbers. Strong constitution, good for household or farm work. Previous employers note she's spirited." The crowd chuckled at the euphemism. Daniel found himself pushing forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he got closer, he could see her more clearly. Unlike the other children who kept their eyes downcast, Clara stared directly at the crowd. Her hair, a deep auburn that caught the light filtering through the dirty windows, was pulled back in a severe braid. Her dress, though patched and worn, was clean. She'd maintained her dignity even in these circumstances. but it was her eyes that struck him most forcefully. Green as spring grass after rain, they held an intelligence and fury that seemed incongruous in one so young. "We'll start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer began. "Who'll give me 10? 5, called out a voice from the back. The speaker was a man Daniel recognized, Josiah Blackwood, who owned several factories downtown. The stories about his treatment of workers were legendary, none of them good. $5 for Mr. Blackwood. Do I hear 7? Claire's eyes found Blackwood in the crowd, and Daniel saw her jaw clench. She knew who he was, knew what fate awaited her in his factories. 7, another voice called. This from a woman in an expensive dress, her face painted with rouge and powder. One of the madams from the district, Daniel realized with growing disgust. 10, Blackwood countered immediately. The madam shrugged and turned away. Apparently the girl wasn't worth more to her. Claire's hands, which had been steady at her sides, began to tremble slightly. Not with fear, Daniel realized, but with rage. $10 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. $50. The words left Daniel's mouth before he'd even realized he was going to speak. The entire warehouse fell silent, every head turning to stare at him. Even Clara's composure cracked, her eyes widening in surprise. I'm sorry, sir, the auctioneer stammered. Did you say 50? I did. Daniel's voice was steady now, committed to this unexpected course. $50 for the girl's contract. Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his face red with indignation. That's absurd. No laborer is worth $50. Then don't bid against me, Daniel replied calmly, though his heart was racing. 51, Blackwood snarled. 100. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer looked like he might faint from shock. Clara's mouth had fallen open, all pretense of defiance momentarily forgotten. Blackwood's face went from red to purple. You're insane, Hayes. I know who you are, that barren ranch of yours out west. What do you need with a girl anyway? Your wife finally give up hoping for a miracle. The cruelty of the words hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. My reasons are my own. $100 stands. Blackwood spat on the floor. Keep her then, but mark my words, you'll regret this foolishness. $100 going once? The auctioneer called, his voice cracking with excitement at the unprecedented sum. Going twice? Sold to Mr. Daniel Hayes. As Daniel approached the platform to sign the papers and collect his purchase, though the word made him sick to use, Clara descended the steps slowly, as if in a dream. Up close, he could see the sharp intelligence in her eyes giving way to confusion and not a small amount of suspicion. Why? She asked quietly, her Irish accent coloring the single word. I don't rightly know, Daniel admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. But no child should be sold like cattle. Come on, let's get you out of here. As they walked toward the exit, Daniel heard the whispers following them. Fool, waste of money. He'll learn. But there was something else too in Clara's measured steps beside him, in the way she held her head high despite everything. He'd made a choice that made no logical sense, paid a fortune for a stranger, a child who might rob him blind and disappear into the night. Yet something told him this moment, this choice would matter more than he could possibly imagine. The sun was fully up when they emerged from the warehouse, and Daniel had to shield his eyes against its brightness. Clara stood beside him, blinking in the light like someone emerging from a long darkness. The street was busy now, full of merchants and sailors, ladies with parasols and gentlemen in fine suits. None of them paid any attention to the man and girl standing outside the warehouse, just another transaction in a city built on commerce of every kind. Do you have belongings to collect? Daniel asked, realizing he had no idea what to do next. Clara shook her head. Everything I own, I'm wearing. Then we'd best get you some supplies before we head to the ranch. It's a long ride. The ranch? She looked at him suspiciously. What kind of ranch? Cattle, mostly. Some horses. It's about a day's ride west near Columbus. And what am I to do there? Daniel considered the question. He hadn't thought that far ahead, had acted on pure instinct. Help with the household, I suppose. My wife Eleanor could use the company. Can you really read and write like they said? Better than most, Clara replied with a hint of pride. The nuns taught me before. She trailed off, unwilling to share more. Before what? Before they died. Cholera took the whole orphanage 2 years back. I've been managing since then. 2 years. She'd been surviving on her own since she was 12. Daniel felt a fresh wave of anger at the system that had failed her so completely. They stopped at a general store where Daniel purchased a few dresses that looked about Clara's size. Some undergarments, a coat for the cooling weather, and a proper pair of boots. Clara stood silent through it all, watching him with those intense green eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You're not what I expected," she finally said, as they loaded the purchases onto his horse. "What did you expect?" Men who pay that much for a girl usually have particular reasons. The implication in her words made Daniel's stomach turn. How much had this child seen in her short life? How much had she endured? "I have a wife," he said firmly. "Eleanor. She's a good woman. You'll be safe with us." Everyone says that at first. The cynicism in her young voice broke his heart, but he didn't argue. Words were cheap, he'd have to prove himself through actions. They stopped at a boarding house to rest and eat before beginning the journey. Daniel sent a telegram to Eleanor, keeping it brief. "Bringing home help for household. Young girl Irish, arrive tomorrow evening. Will explain. Love, D." He could imagine Eleanor's confusion, possibly her frustration. They'd discussed hiring help before, but never followed through. How would he explain the morning's events? How could he make her understand the compulsion that had driven him to spend what amounted to 3 months' profit on a stranger? Clara ate her meal, beef stew and cornbread, with careful precision, as if she was afraid it might be taken away. She cleaned her plate completely, even using the bread to sop up the last of the gravy. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Daniel asked. "Define proper," Clara replied, then seemed to catch herself. "I'm sorry, that was rude." "No, it was honest. I prefer honest." She studied him again with those penetrating eyes. 3 days ago. The holding house where they keep us between auctions. They don't waste much food on us." "That ends now," Daniel said firmly. "As long as you're with us, you'll never go hungry. Nothing's free in this world, Mr. Hayes. What's the real cost?" "Work," he said simply. "Honest work. Fair treatment and a roof over your head. That's all." Clara nodded slowly, but he could see she didn't quite believe him. Trust would take time. As they prepared to leave Galveston, Daniel caught Clara looking back at the city with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Leaving something behind?" he asked. "Everything," she said quietly, "but nothing worth keeping." They mounted the horse, Clara sitting in front of Daniel, since she'd never ridden before. As they rode out of the city, he felt her gradually relax against him. Exhaustion finally overcoming her vigilance. The road stretched ahead, leading toward a future none of them could have imagined. The Texas countryside opened before them, vast and wild. Prairie grass swayed in the wind, and the sky seemed endless, unmarred by factory smoke or crowded tenements. Clara had been silent for the first hour, but as Galveston disappeared behind them, she began to ask questions. "How big is your ranch?" "About 2,000 acres, not the biggest in the county, but respectable." "And your wife Eleanor, does she know about me?" "She knows you're coming. The rest we'll explain together." "Will she be angry about the money?" Daniel considered this. Eleanor was practical, prudent with their finances. $100 was no small sum, but she was also compassionate with a heart that ached for children. "She'll understand," he said, hoping it was true. As the sun climbed higher, Clara began to share fragments of her story. Her parents had come from Ireland during the famine, seeking a better life in America. Her father had found work on the docks in Galveston, her mother taking in washing. They'd been poor but happy, she said, until the yellow fever came. "I was 11 when they died," she said matter-of-factly. "The nuns took me in, taught me my letters and numbers, said I was bright, could maybe become a teacher someday. Then the cholera came and took them too. And after that, workhouses mostly, factories when I could manage it, but I kept running away." A hint of pride colored her voice. "They'd catch me eventually, but I always tried." Why didn't you leave the city entirely? Clara was quiet for a moment. I had my reasons. There was a story there Daniel sensed, but he didn't push. The girl had a right to her secrets. As afternoon wore on, they stopped to rest the horse by a stream. Clara wandered to the water's edge, kneeling to splash her face and drink deeply. Watching her, Daniel was struck by how young she looked in that moment, despite the premature age in her eyes. 14 years old, and she'd already lived through more hardship than most saw in a lifetime. It's so quiet here, she said, wonderingly. I'd forgotten the world could be quiet. You get used to it. Some find it unsettling at first. No, she said firmly. It's perfect. They continued on as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Claire had never seen a sunset unobstructed by buildings, and she watched in fascination as the colors shifted and changed. Does it do this every evening? Weather permitting. Then how does anyone get any work done? I'd just sit and watch. Daniel chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd had in months. You'd be surprised how quickly wonder becomes routine. I hope not, Clara said. I hope I never get used to this. As darkness began to fall, Daniel spotted the lights of Columbus in the distance. They'd stay at an inn tonight, arrive at the ranch fresh tomorrow. He could have pushed through, but Clara was exhausted, and he wanted Eleanor to meet the girl when both were rested. The inn was modest but clean. Daniel secured 2 rooms, ignoring the curious looks from the proprietor. Clara seemed overwhelmed by having a room to herself, standing in the doorway as if afraid to enter. It's yours for the night, Daniel assured her. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer. I'll be right next door if you need anything. Why are you doing this? She asked again. Really, the truth. Daniel thought about it, wanting to give her the honest answer she deserved. My wife and I, we've wanted children for 15 years. It hasn't happened for us. Maybe when I saw you standing there refusing to be broken despite everything, maybe I saw the daughter we never had, or maybe I just couldn't stand to watch another child disappear into that crowd. I don't have a perfect answer. Clara nodded slowly. That's the first thing you've said that I completely believe. After she'd closed her door, Daniel sat in his own room composing a longer letter to Eleanor. He told her everything, the warehouse, the auction. Claire's defiance, his impulsive bid. He tried to explain the feeling that had overcome him, the certainty that this was meant to be. He sealed the letter and paid the innkeeper's son to ride ahead and deliver it so Eleanor would have time to prepare. That night, Daniel was awakened by sounds from the next room, Clara crying out in her sleep. He heard her moving around, probably pacing, trying to shake off whatever nightmares plagued her. He wanted to knock to offer comfort, but instinct told him she needed to work through this alone, that his presence might frighten more than comfort. Eventually the sound stopped, and he hoped she'd found peace. The next morning, Clara emerged looking tired but determined. She'd washed and braided her hair, put on one of the new dresses. She looked almost like any other young woman except for the wariness that never quite left her eyes. Ready, Daniel asked, as I'll ever be. The final stretch to the ranch took them through Hazeland. Daniel pointed out the boundaries, the creek that marked the eastern edge, the rise where you could see for miles in every direction. Clara absorbed it all silently, her eyes wide with wonder at the sheer space of it. Then finally, the house came into view. It was a solid 2-story structure, painted white with green shutters. Not grand, but welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Daniel could see Eleanor's garden still producing despite the latening season. As they approached, the front door opened, and Eleanor stepped onto the porch. Daniel's breath caught, as it always did when he saw his wife after an absence. At 35, Eleanor was still beautiful, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, her blue eyes warm despite the questions that must be burning in them. She wore her favorite dress, the lavender one that brought out her eyes, and Daniel knew she'd dressed carefully for this meeting. As they dismounted, Eleanor descended the porch steps slowly, her eyes moving between Daniel and Clara. When she reached them, she surprised Daniel by addressing Clara first. You must be Clara. I'm Eleanor. Welcome to our home. Clara, who'd been ready for suspicion or resentment, seemed taken aback by the genuine warmth in Eleanor's voice. Thank you, ma'am. You must be tired from the journey. Come, let's get you settled. Daniel, bring her things. As Eleanor led Clara into the house, Daniel heard her asking about the girl's favorite foods, whether she preferred her room warm or cool, if she needed anything special. His heart swelled with love for his wife, who'd chosen kindness despite the shock she must be feeling. Inside the house was as warm and welcoming as Eleanor had made it over their 15 years of marriage. She'd prepared the guest room, the one they'd always imagined would belong to a child. The quilt on the bed was one she'd made years ago, decorated with tiny embroidered flowers. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the dresser, and the window looked out over the garden. Clara stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. This is for me." "Of course," Eleanor said. "Every person needs their own space, somewhere that's just theirs." "I've never—" Clara stopped, swallowing hard. "Thank you." Eleanor touched the girl's shoulder gently. "You're welcome here, Clara. Whatever brought you to us, you're welcome." That evening, over a dinner of roast chicken and vegetables from Eleanor's garden, the awkwardness began to ease. Clara helped with the dishes, without being asked, moving around Eleanor in the kitchen, as if they'd been doing this dance for years. Daniel watched from the doorway, seeing how naturally they fell into rhythm together. Later, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor asked Clara about her education. "You can read and write," Daniel says. "Yes, ma'am. And figure numbers. The sister said I had a head for mathematics." "Could you show me?" Clara looked uncertain. "I don't want to seem boastful." "Knowledge isn't boastful," Eleanor said firmly. "It's a gift to be shared." Daniel fetched paper and pencil, and Clara demonstrated her abilities. Her handwriting was neat and precise, her arithmetic quick and accurate. When Eleanor posed more complex problems, calculating interest on loans, figuring proportions for recipes expanded to feed more people, Clara solved them with ease. "You're quite gifted," Eleanor said, and Clara flushed with pleasure at the praise. "The sisters said I could have gone to academy if—" She trailed off. "If circumstances had been different," Eleanor finished gently. "Well, circumstances are different now." As the evening wound down, Daniel walked Clara to her room. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. "Your wife. She's not what I expected either. Eleanor has a gift for surprising people. She doesn't resent me for the money you spent. Eleanor understands that some things are worth more than money." Clara nodded slowly. "I'll work hard. I'll earn my keep. You won't regret this." "You don't have to earn anything, Clara. You're not a purchase to justify. You're a young woman who needs a home, and we have one to offer." For the first time since he'd met her, Clara's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to show what she must consider weakness. "Good night, Mr. Hayes." "Good night, Clara." As Daniel joined Eleanor in their bedroom, she was brushing out her long hair, a nightly ritual he loved to watch. $100? She said mildly. "I know. That's more than we spent on our wedding." "I know." She set down the brush and turned to him. "You did the right thing." Relief flooded through him. "You think so?" "I know so. That girl, she's special, Daniel. Hurt and suspicious and probably carrying secrets we can't imagine, but special. Did you see how she held her fork? Perfect manners despite everything. Someone loved that girl once taught her to be a lady. Her parents before the fever took them." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "She's about the age our Mary would have been." They rarely spoke of the baby they'd lost, the daughter who'd lived only 3 days. Mary Elizabeth Hayes was buried in the small cemetery at the edge of their property, her tiny grave marked with a lamb carved from white stone. "I thought of that too," Daniel admitted. "We can't replace her." "No, but maybe we can give Clara what Mary never got the chance to have. And maybe she can give us something too." Eleanor moved into his arms, and they stood together in the lamplight, holding each other and thinking of possibilities. "There's something else," Eleanor said after a moment. "When I was preparing her room, I found Tom Garrett in the barn. He said he was looking for work, but something felt off. He was asking questions about you being gone, whether I was alone here often. Tom Garrett had worked for them briefly last year before Daniel had dismissed him for drinking and laziness. The man had left angry, making threats neither of them had taken seriously. I'll speak to the hands tomorrow. Make sure they keep an eye out." "Do you think he means trouble?" "Probably just looking for work like he said, but we'll be careful." As they prepared for bed, Daniel thought about the day's events. The horror of the auction house, Clara's defiance. His impulsive bid the long ride home. It felt like a lifetime had passed since morning. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night horses nickering in the stable, the distant low of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass. Somewhere in this house, a girl who'd been for sale that morning was sleeping in a soft bed, safe for perhaps the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Clara learning the rhythms of ranch life, the three of them figuring out how to be a family of sorts. There would be questions from neighbors, judgment from those who thought they knew better. And somewhere in Clara's past, there were shadows she hadn't yet revealed. Reasons she'd stayed in Galveston when she could have run. But tonight, Daniel thought, as sleep finally claimed him tonight, they'd taken the first step toward something new. A decision made in a moment of moral clarity had brought them Clara, and Clara had brought them possibility. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The moon rose over the Hayes Ranch, silver light spilling across the prairie, and for the first time in 2 years, Clara Sullivan slept without fear, dreaming not of warehouses and factories, but of endless skies and the strange kindness of strangers who'd paid a fortune just to give her freedom. The first weeks passed in a careful dance of adjustment. Clara woke each morning before dawn, a habit from the factories where tardiness meant lost wages or worse. She'd dress quietly in the darkness, creeping downstairs to find Eleanor already in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. "You don't need to rise so early," Eleanor said on the fourth morning, not looking up from her work. "This isn't a factory. You can rest." "I can't seem to help it," Clara admitted, moving to help without being asked. Her hands found the rhythm of kneading naturally, and Eleanor smiled at the sight. "My mother taught me that bread knows when you're angry," Eleanor said conversationally. "It won't rise properly if you knead it with fury in your heart." Clara considered this as she worked the dough. "Then I've been making angry bread all my life. And now," Clara's hand stilled for a moment, "now, I'm not sure what I'm making." They worked in companionable silence until the sun painted the kitchen golden. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his hair still mussed from sleep, and Clara noticed how Eleanor's face lit up at the sight of him. It was such a small thing that brightening, but it spoke of a love that had endured 15 years of disappointment without souring. "Morning, ladies. That bread smells like heaven itself." "Flattery will get you an extra slice," Eleanor teased, and Daniel crossed the kitchen to kiss her cheek, a gesture so natural and tender that Clara had to look away. She'd never seen such easy affection between married people. Her own parents had loved each other. She remembered that much, but it had been a love worn down by poverty and worry. This was different, comfortable, settled, sure. After breakfast, Daniel took Clara on a tour of the ranch proper. She'd seen the boundaries during their ride in, but now he showed her the details. The barn with its neat rows of stalls, the chicken coop Eleanor tended religiously, the vegetable garden that would need preparing for winter, soon the small orchard of pecan trees that provided extra income in good years. "It's not a fortune," Daniel explained as they walked, "but it's honest work. The land provides if you treat it with respect." Clara nodded, absorbing everything. When they reached the stable, she stopped short at the sight of a magnificent black horse in the first stall. "That's Midnight," Daniel said, noting her interest. "Temperamental beast, but loyal once he knows you. Would you like to learn to ride?" Clara's eyes widened. "Women don't ride. Not proper women anyway." Daniel laughed. "This is Texas Clara. Out here everyone rides. It's not about being proper, it's about being practical. Eleanor can outride most men in the county, though she'd never boast about it." The idea of Eleanor racing across the prairie on horseback was so at odds with her gentle domestic presence that Clara couldn't quite picture it. But over the following days, as Daniel began teaching her the basics of horsemanship, she discovered that Eleanor was indeed an accomplished rider. The older woman would sometimes join their lessons, offering quiet corrections to Clara's posture or grip. "Confidence," Eleanor would say. "The horse knows if you're afraid. Be afraid if you must, but don't let him know it." It was advice that seemed to apply to more than just riding. The ranch hands were curious about Clara, but respectful. Word had somehow spread about the astronomical sum Daniel had paid for her freedom, and while some clearly thought him foolish, none dared say so to his face. Clara noticed how they watched her, though, waiting to see if she'd prove worth the investment she supposed. One hand in particular made her uncomfortable. Jake Morrison was young, maybe 20, with sandy hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He found excuses to be wherever Clara was working, offering help she didn't need standing just a bit too close. "You ever want to see the town? I'd be happy to escort you," he offered one afternoon as Clara collected eggs. "That's kind, but I'm content here," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "Pretty girl like you shouldn't hide away on a ranch. There's dancing on Saturday nights. I could show you a real good time." Something in his tone made Clara's skin crawl. She'd heard that tone before in the factories from men who thought a girl without family was a girl without protection. "I said no thank you." Her voice was firm now, and she straightened to her full height. Jake stepped closer, blocking her path to the house. "No need to be unfriendly. I'm just trying to—" "Morrison!" Daniel's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Don't you have work to do?" Jake stepped back immediately, his face flushing. "Yes, sir. Just offering to help Miss Clara with the eggs." "She doesn't need your help. Get back to the barn." As Jake slouched away, Daniel approached Clara, his expression concerned. "Has he been bothering you?" "Nothing I can't handle," Clara said, then caught herself. "But thank you. You let me know if he or anyone else gives you trouble. You're under my protection here, Clara. That means something." That evening, Clara overheard Daniel speaking quietly to his foreman, a grizzled older man named Samuel. "Keep Morrison away from the girl. If he can't respect that, he's gone." "Yes, sir." The boys were wondering, is she family? "The girl." There was a pause before Daniel answered. "She's under our care. That's all anyone needs to know." But Clara was beginning to feel like more than just someone under their care. Eleanor had started teaching her the finer points of household management, not just cooking and cleaning, which Clara knew well enough, but the art of stretching money planning meals around what the garden provided, preserving food for winter. These were skills of a different sort than what she'd learned in the factory's skills that assumed a future, a permanence. "You have a quick mind," Eleanor said one evening as they went over the household accounts together. Clara had spotted an error in the grocer's billing that had been overcharging them for months. "Numbers make sense," Clara replied. "They don't lie or pretend to be something they're not." Unlike people, Clara looked up, meeting Eleanor's knowing gaze. "I didn't mean, it's all right. Trust takes time, especially when it's been broken before." Eleanor's hand covered Clara's briefly. "We're patient people, Daniel and I. We've had to be." That night, Clara lay in her soft bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about trust. For 2 years, she'd trusted no one but herself. Even before that, in the orphanage, she'd learned that kindness often came with a price. But these people, they seemed to want nothing from her except what she was willing to give. It was unsettling in its unfamiliarity. A sound from outside made her sit up. Footsteps slow and deliberate circling the house. Clara crept to the window, peering through the curtains. A figure moved through the darkness, too far away to identify clearly, but something about the way he moved seemed purposeful, searching. She padded quietly to Daniel and Eleanor's room, knocking softly. Daniel answered immediately, alert despite the late hour. "Someone's outside," Clara whispered. "Walking around the house." Daniel grabbed his rifle without hesitation. "Wake Eleanor. Both of you stay inside." But Eleanor was already awake, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown. It could be nothing. Maybe one of the hands checking on something. "Maybe," Daniel agreed, but his grip on the rifle suggested he didn't believe it. They heard the front door rattle as if someone was testing the lock. Daniel moved toward the stairs, but before he could descend, there was a crash from the kitchen breaking glass. "Stay here," he ordered, but Clara followed him anyway, grabbing a poker from the fireplace as she went. Eleanor came too, carrying a lamp that cast wild shadows on the walls. In the kitchen, they found Tom Garrett climbing through the broken window, clearly drunk and angry. He saw Daniel's rifle and laughed an ugly sound. "Come to take what's mine," he slurred. "You owe me Hayes. 3 months' wages you never paid." "I paid you exactly what you earned before I fired you for stealing," Daniel replied calmly. "Get out of my house." "Not until I get satisfaction." Garrett's eyes found Clara, and his expression changed, becoming sly. "Heard you paid $100 for this one. Must be something special about her. Maybe I'll take her as payment." He lunged forward faster than his drunken state suggested possible. Daniel raised the rifle, but Garrett was too close, knocking it aside. They grappled, crashing into the kitchen table. Eleanor screamed, and Clara acted without thinking, bringing the poker down on Garrett's shoulder. He howled in pain, releasing Daniel, who immediately landed a solid punch to his jaw. Garrett stumbled backward toward the broken window, but as he fell, his hand caught Clara's sleeve, dragging her with him. She felt herself being pulled toward the jagged glass, saw the malicious triumph in Garrett's eyes. If he was going down, he'd take her with him. Then Eleanor was there, bringing a cast-iron pan down on Garrett's wrist, with a crack that made everyone wince. He released Clara, who fell backward into Daniel's steadying arms. Garrett tumbled through the window alone, landing in a heap in Eleanor's herb garden. "Samuel T.," Daniel shouted, and within moments the foreman and two other hands appeared, having heard the commotion from the bunkhouse. "Get him off my property. If he comes back, shoot him." As the men dragged the semi-conscious Garrett away, Daniel examined Clara's arm, where Garrett had grabbed her. The sleeve was torn, and there were bruises already forming on her skin. "I'm fine," she insisted, though she was shaking. Eleanor wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You were very brave. That poker probably saved Daniel from a knife in the ribs. Garrett always carried one." "You weren't so bad with that pan yourself," Clara managed, and surprisingly found herself almost smiling. They spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, Daniel boarding up the broken window, while Eleanor made tea with plenty of sugar for shock. Clara noticed how they moved together, checking on each other with touches and glances, making sure everyone was truly all right. "This is my fault," Clara said suddenly. "If you hadn't taken me in, he wouldn't have come here. He wanted money, and he knew you'd spent—" "Stop," Daniel said firmly. "Tom Garrett has been a problem long before you came here. This would have happened eventually regardless." "But," Eleanor interrupted gently, "bad people do bad things. It's not the fault of the good people they do them to. You didn't break that window or attack anyone. You defended this family, our family." The word hung in the air between them. Family. Clara had been part of a family once before fever and circumstance tore it away. Could she dare to be part of one again? Dawn was breaking by the time they finally retired, exhausted but somehow closer for the shared danger. As Clara returned to her room, she found herself thinking not of Garrett's attack, but of Eleanor's fierce protection of Daniel's immediate response to defend them all. They'd fought for her, risked themselves for her. When had anyone last done that? The following days brought a stream of visitors, word of the incident having spread through the county with the speed that only gossip can achieve. Some came out of genuine concern, others out of thinly veiled curiosity about the girl Daniel Hayes had paid a fortune for. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, was among the first to call. She examined Clara with sharp eyes while maintaining a flow of sympathetic chatter about the terrible incident with that awful Garrett man. "And you, dear?" she said to Clara. "How are you finding life on the ranch? Such a change from the city, I imagine." "It's peaceful, sir," Clara replied carefully, aware that every word would be repeated across the county. "And you're helping with the household?" "Clara has been invaluable," Eleanor interjected smoothly. "She has a wonderful head for figures, and her help with the accounts has been tremendous." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "She does the accounts? How unusual." "These are unusual times," Eleanor replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We must all adapt." After Mrs. Patterson left, trailing promises to pray for their safety, Eleanor turned to Clara with a sigh. "That woman could find gossip in an empty room. By tomorrow, the entire county will know our business." "I'm sorry," Clara began, but Eleanor waved her off. "Don't be. Let them talk. They've been gossiping about Daniel and me for years anyway, the barren couple they call us. As if our worth was measured only in children produced." The bitterness in her voice was unusual, and Clara saw for the first time how much pain lay beneath Eleanor's serene exterior. "It's cruel," Clara said quietly, "to judge someone for something beyond their control." Eleanor looked at her with surprise and something like gratitude. "Yes, it is." That evening, Daniel announced he was riding to town to speak with the sheriff about Garrett. Clara asked to accompany him, wanting to see the town properly for the first time since her arrival. The ride to Columbus took 2 hours, and Clara peppered Daniel with questions about the area, the people, the history. He answered patiently, seemingly pleased by her interest. "You're thinking of this as home," he observed. Clara considered this. I'm trying to. It's been a long time since I've had one. What happened after the orphanage? You said you managed for 2 years, but you haven't said how. Clara was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice carefully neutral. I worked in factories at first. 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay was barely enough for a corner of a shared room and 1 meal a day. Girls kept disappearing. Some got sick, some just gave up, some found other ways to survive that I couldn't stomach. I ran away 3 times. Each time they caught me, the work got worse, the pay got smaller. And that's when you ended up at the auction. No. Clara's hands tightened on the saddle horn. First, I met someone who promised to help. He said he ran a boarding house for working girls, safe and clean. He seemed kind. Daniel felt his jaw clench already, knowing where this story was going. It wasn't a boarding house. Well, not the kind he'd described. When I figured out what he really wanted, I tried to leave. He didn't take it well. Said I owed him for room and board, that I'd work off the debt one way or another. Clara, I stole from him, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out. Not money, though he had plenty. Papers, documents, records of his business dealings, including the names of very important men who were his clients. I told him if anything happened to me, those papers would find their way to the newspaper. Daniel looked at her with new respect. That was clever. And dangerous. It was survival. He let me go, but he made sure I was blacklisted from any legitimate work in Galveston. That's how I ended up at the auction. When you can't find legal work and won't do illegal work, there aren't many options left. These papers, do you still have them? Clara met his eyes steadily. What papers? Daniel understood. Some insurance policies were better left unmentioned. You're safe now. You know that, don't you? I'm beginning to believe it, Clara admitted. Though I keep waiting for the catch. Nothing good in my life has ever come without a price. Sometimes, Daniel said gently, good things just happen. Sometimes people help because it's right, not because they want something in return. Columbus was busier than Clara expected, with a proper main street lined with shops and businesses. People stared as they passed, clearly recognizing Daniel and curious about his companion. Daniel seemed oblivious to the attention, but Clara felt every gaze like a physical weight. The sheriff's office was near the center of town, a solid building with barred windows. Sheriff Coleman was a large man with kind eyes and a handlebar mustache that seemed to have its own personality. Daniel heard you had some trouble out your way. Tom Garrett broke into our home gym, threatened my wife and Clara here. I want charges pressed. Coleman's expression darkened. That no-good drunk. I'll put out a warrant, but he's probably halfway to Houston by now. Men like Garrett are cowards at heart. They don't stick around after they've been caught. If he comes back, you're within your rights to defend your property and family, Coleman said firmly. His eyes moved to Clara, curious but not unkind. You must be the young lady everyone's talking about. Clara lifted her chin. I suppose I am. Daniel did a good thing getting you out of Galveston. That city's no place for a young woman alone. After leaving the sheriff's office, Daniel suggested they visit the general store for supplies. The proprietor, Mr. Chen, was a Chinese immigrant who'd been in Columbus longer than most of the other residents. His store was neat and well-stocked with everything from fabric to farming equipment. Mr. Hayes, good to see you. And this must be Miss Clara. Clara was surprised to be addressed so directly. How did you know? Chen smiled. In a town this size, everyone knows everything. Mrs. Patterson was here earlier, very concerned about your welfare after the incident with Garrett. I bet she was, Daniel muttered. As they gathered supplies, Clara noticed Chen watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, as Daniel was examining some new tools, Chen approached her quietly. You came from Galveston, yes. Clara nodded warily. I have cousin there. He writes to me about the city, about the business with children and contracts. His voice was careful, neutral. He says there is man there, Mr. Blackwood, who is very angry about losing a particular girl to a rancher, says she stole something from him. Clara's blood went cold. I don't know what you mean. Of course not, Chen agreed easily. I simply mention it as local gossip. Also to say that if someone were to have such troubles, they would find friends here. Mr. Hayes is a respected man. His friends are our friends. Before Clara could respond, Daniel returned with his selections. As they left the store, Clara's mind raced. Blackwood hadn't bid on her at the auction, he'd bid on someone who'd stolen from him. But how had he discovered her identity? And more importantly, what would he do about it? The ride home was quiet. Clara lost in her worries. Daniel seemed to sense her mood and didn't press for conversation. As they approached the ranch, however, he spoke. "Whatever you're afraid of, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore." That night at dinner, Clara made a decision. These people had taken her in, fought for her, treated her with more kindness than she'd known in years. They deserved the truth. "I need to tell you something," she began, setting down her fork. "About Galveston. About why I really couldn't leave." Eleanor and Daniel exchanged glances but said nothing, waiting. "The man I stole from, his name is Marcus Blackwood. Not the same Blackwood from the auction, but his brother. Marcus runs establishments, the kind where girls work but never earn enough to leave. He has connections everywhere, police, judges, businessmen. The papers I took could destroy half the wealthy men in Galveston. And he wants them back," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. "He wants them destroyed, and he wants me dead to ensure I never tell what I know." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Chen at the store, he warned me. Marcus knows where I am. He'll come for me or send someone. I should leave. Tonight. Before I bring more trouble to your door." "Absolutely not," Eleanor said firmly. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Eleanor interrupted. "You're part of this family now. We don't abandon family when things get difficult." "But I'm not family, I'm just—" "Just what?" Daniel asked. "Just the young woman who's brought life back to this house? Just the daughter we've been praying for in all but blood? Just Clara who stood with us against Garrett with nothing but a poker and courage?" Clara felt tears threatening an unfamiliar burning behind her eyes. "You don't owe me anything." "This isn't about owing," Eleanor said softly. "This is about choosing. We choose to stand with you. The question is, will you choose to stay with us?" The tears came, then silent streams down Clara's cheeks. For so long she'd been alone, fighting just to survive another day. The idea that someone would fight beside her for her was almost too much to bear. "I'll stay," she whispered. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." Daniel reached across the table, covering her hand with his weathered one. "Then we'd best prepare. If this Blackwood is coming, we'll be ready for him." Over the following days, the ranch transformed into something resembling a fortress. Daniel hired additional men, choosing carefully from those he knew and trusted. Samuel, the foreman, took to wearing his pistol at all times. Eleanor learned to shoot, practicing with determined intensity until she could hit a tin can at 50 paces. Clara showed them the papers she'd hidden sewn into the lining of her old dress, the one she'd worn at the auction. The names on them were indeed explosive judges, senators, even a congressman, all detailed with dates, payments, and preferences that would destroy their reputations and likely land them in prison. "This is dynamite," Daniel said, reading through them. "No wonder Blackwood wants you silenced." "We could send them to the newspapers," Eleanor suggested. "Remove his reason for coming after Clara." "No," Clara said firmly. "Those papers are my insurance. As long as I have them and he knows it, he has to be careful. If they're published, he has nothing to lose by killing me." It was Jake Morrison who spotted the riders first. 4 men moving slowly along the eastern boundary of the ranch, studying the land with the careful attention of those planning an attack. He rode hard back to the house, finding Daniel in the barn. "Strangers, Mr. Hayes," 4 of them armed, checking our fence lines. Daniel nodded grimly. "It begins. Get Samuel and the others. Everyone arms themselves. Eleanor and Clara to the house." But Clara refused to hide. "This is my fight. I won't cower while others risk themselves for me." "Clara," Daniel began, but she cut him off. "I've been running and hiding for 2 years, no more. If Blackwood wants me, he'll have to take me from my home, from my family. And we won't make it easy for him." The attack came at dawn 2 days later. Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass. Not the kitchen this time, but the parlor window. She grabbed the rifle Daniel had taught her to use and crept toward the stairs. Eleanor was already there, her own weapon ready, while Daniel coordinated with the ranch hands outside. Through the broken window, a voice called out, "Cultured cold," and terrifyingly familiar. "Miss Sullivan? Or should I say Miss O'Brien? You've led me quite a chase, changing your name like that." Clara's heart hammered. Marcus Blackwood himself had come. She'd hoped he'd only send men, but apparently she was worth his personal attention. "Come out, dear girl. We have business to discuss. No need for anyone to get hurt." "Go to hell, Blackwood," Clara shouted back, surprising herself with the vehemence. "Such language! And here I thought the nuns had taught you better." "Oh yes, I know all about your past, your poor dead parents, your time with the sisters. I know everything about you, Clara, just as I know about the Hayes family, their struggles, their desperate desire for a child. How touching that they've taken you in. It would be such a shame if something happened to them." Eleanor's hand found Clara's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Don't let him manipulate you." Through the window, they could see Daniel and Samuel taking positions behind the water trough while other ranch hands spread out around the property. They were outnumbered. Blackwood had brought at least a dozen men, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. "Mr. Hayes, Blackwood called. "You've been deceived. This girl is a thief and a liar. She stole from me, and I'm within my rights to retrieve my property." "Clara is under my protection," Daniel called back. "You have no rights here, Blackwood. This is Texas, not your cesspool in Galveston." $100 is a lot to pay for damaged goods, Hayes, but I'm a reasonable man. I'll reimburse you the full amount plus 50 for your trouble. Simply send the girl out, and we'll be on our way." "Not happening." "Then you've chosen death over dollars. So be it." The first gunshot shattered the morning stillness, followed immediately by a hail of bullets. Clara and Eleanor dropped to the floor as lead peppered the house's walls. Outside, they could hear Daniel and the hands returning fire, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns. "The back," Eleanor suddenly exclaimed. "They'll try the back door while we're focused on the front." She was right. Even as she spoke, they heard footsteps on the back porch. Clara and Eleanor positioned themselves with clear sight lines to the kitchen entrance. When the door burst open and two men charged in, they were ready. Clara's shot took the first man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the kitchen table. Eleanor's blast from the shotgun sent the second man diving back outside, cursing loudly. "Good shooting," Eleanor said with grim satisfaction. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Clara lost track of how many times she fired, reloaded, fired again. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick, her ears rang from the constant gunfire, but she didn't stop. Then suddenly she heard something that made her blood freeze, Daniel's voice crying out in pain. Without thinking, Clara ran for the front door, ignoring Eleanor's shout to stop. She burst onto the porch to see Daniel on the ground near the water trough, blood spreading across his shirt. Samuel standing over him, trying to defend him while returning fire. Clara didn't remember crossing the yard. One moment she was on the porch, the next she was beside Daniel, tearing her petticoat to make bandages. Bullets whined overhead, but she didn't care. "You stupid, brave girl," Daniel gasped, managing a pained smile. "Get back to the house." "Not without you." Samuel and Clara managed to drag Daniel behind better cover as the firefight continued. The wound was in his side, painful and bloody, but not immediately fatal if they could stop the bleeding. Clara pressed the makeshift bandages against the wound, her hands quickly covered in blood. That's when she heard horses approaching from the west. Many horses. Her heart sank. Blackwood had brought reinforcements. They were finished. But then a new voice rang out, strong and commanding. "This is Sheriff Coleman. Everyone drop your weapons now, or we'll drop you where you stand." The cavalry had arrived literally. Coleman had brought a posse of 20 men, all armed, all with their weapons trained on Blackwood's group. Faced with overwhelming numbers and the presence of legal authority, Blackwood's men began throwing down their weapons. Blackwood himself stood slowly, his fine suit dusty, but his dignity intact. "Sheriff, this woman is a thief. I'm merely retrieving what's mine." "What I see," Coleman said, riding closer, "is a group of men from outside my jurisdiction attacking law-abiding citizens of my county. That's attempted murder in my book, Blackwood." "You don't know who you're dealing with," Blackwood said coldly. "I have connections. In Galveston, maybe. But this is Columbus, and here you're just another criminal." Coleman turned to his men. "Arrest them all." As Blackwood was led away in shackles, he passed close to Clara, who was still kneeling beside Daniel. His voice was low, meant only for her. "This isn't over, girl. Those papers won't protect you forever." Clara met his gaze steadily. They don't have to, just long enough for you to rot in prison. His face contorted with rage, but the deputies dragged him away before he could respond. The aftermath was a blur of activity. The doctor was summoned for Daniel, proclaiming the wound serious but survivable with proper care. 2 of Blackwood's men were dead, 3 wounded, and the rest were headed for jail. Miraculously, none of the ranch defenders had been killed, though several bore minor wounds. As the sun set that day, Clara sat beside Daniel's bed where he lay pale but stable. Eleanor sat on his other side holding his hand. The house bore the scars of battle, bullet holes, broken windows, damaged furniture, but it still stood. "I'm so sorry," Clara said for the 10th time. "This is all my fault." "Stop," Daniel said weakly. "We've been through this. Family protects family." "But the ranch, the damage or injury." "We'll all heal," Eleanor finished. "Clara, do you know what Daniel said to me the night after he brought you home? He said he felt like God had finally answered our prayers, just not in the way we expected. We asked for a child of our body, but he gave us a child of our heart instead." Clara felt the tears coming again. She'd cried more in the past weeks than in the previous 2 years combined. None of us deserve grace," Eleanor said gently. "That's what makes it grace." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Coleman entered, hat in hand. "Sorry to disturb, but thought you'd want to know. We've been through Blackwood's belongings. Found some interesting papers of his own, seems he was planning to expand his operation, had detailed records of bribes and corruption. Combined with what Clara has, it's enough to put him away for a long time and clean up a good portion of Galveston's underbelly." "You want my papers," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "They'd be helpful, yes, but I understand if you want to keep them as insurance." Clara looked at Daniel and Eleanor, drawing strength from their presence. "Take them. All of them. I don't need them anymore. I have all the protection I need right here." Coleman nodded respectfully. "You've got courage, young lady. All 3 of you do." After he left, the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful after the violence of the day. Tomorrow would bring challenges, repairs to make wounds, to heal a trial to prepare for. There would be gossip and judgment from some, support and respect from others. But tonight, Clara Sullivan, no longer hiding behind false names, no longer running from her past, sat with her chosen family in their battered but unbroken home. Daniel's breathing was steady, Eleanor's presence warm beside her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt truly safe. Not because of papers or threats or deals, but because she was loved, protected, and had finally learned to protect in return. The moon rose over the Texas prairie, casting silver light through the bullet holes in the walls, and Clara thought it looked like stars had come inside to keep them company. Tomorrow, they would begin rebuilding. But tonight, they had won. They had survived. They had chosen each other, and that choice had made all the difference. The weeks following Blackwood's arrest brought an unexpected peace to the Hayes Ranch. Daniel's wound healed slowly but surely, though he chafed at Eleanor's insistence that he remain in bed longer than he deemed necessary. Clara had taken over many of his responsibilities, surprising everyone, including herself, with her natural aptitude for ranch management. "You've got a head for this, Samuel observed one morning as Clara reviewed the ledgers calculating feed costs against expected cattle prices. "Most folks take years to understand these patterns." "Numbers tell stories," so Clara replied, not looking up from her work. "You just have to learn their language." The trial date was set for late November, and the prosecutor had visited twice to prepare Clara's testimony. She dreaded the thought of facing Blackwood again, but knew it was necessary. The papers she'd provided had already led to several arrests in Galveston, and the newspapers were calling it the biggest corruption scandal in Texas history. It was Eleanor who noticed Clara's growing restlessness as the trial approached. She found the girl one evening standing at Daniel's study window, staring out at the darkening prairie. "You're thinking of running," Eleanor said softly. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Clara's shoulders tensed. "How did you know?" "Because I recognized the look. I wore it myself once years ago when Daniel and I first learned we couldn't have children. I wanted to run from the pity, the whispers, the constant reminder of what I couldn't provide." "But you stayed." "I stayed because Daniel reminded me that running from pain doesn't end it. It just spreads it around to the people who love you. Eleanor moved to stand beside Clara. We love you, Daniel and I, not as a replacement for what we lost, but as exactly who you are. Clara turned to face her, and Eleanor was struck again by how much older than 14 those green eyes seemed. I've never testified in court before. What if I say the wrong thing? What if Blackwood's lawyers make me look like a liar? Then we'll deal with it together. But Clara, you've already faced him with a rifle in your hands. Surely words can't be harder than bullets. Despite Eleanor's reassurance, Clara's anxiety grew as November approached. She threw herself into work, rising even earlier, staying up later, as if exhaustion could keep the worry at bay. Daniel, now recovered enough to resume his duties, watched her with concern. You're going to work yourself into sickness, he warned one afternoon, finding her mucking out stalls in the barn, hard physical labor she'd volunteered for, despite it not being her responsibility. I need to keep busy, she said, not pausing in her work. What you need is to talk about what's really bothering you. Clara stopped, then leaning on the pitchfork. In Galveston, at Blackwood's establishment, there was a girl named Mary, barely 13. She tried to testify against him once when another girl died. Blackwood's lawyer made her look like a fool, then a liar, then a whore. By the time he was done, the jury was laughing at her. She took her own life that night. Daniel's face darkened. Clara, I know what you're going to say, that this is different, that Coleman has evidence that times are changing. But men like Blackwood don't lose easily. They destroy what threatens them. Daniel moved closer, gently, taking the pitchfork from her hands. You're right. Men like Blackwood are dangerous. But here's what you're forgetting. You're not alone anymore. You're not some friendless girl they can dismiss. You're Clara Hayes, now claimed as family by people this county respects. That matters more than you know. The use of the Hayes name made Clara's breath catch. They'd been careful about how they referred to her publicly, but hearing Daniel say it so naturally, so protectively, made something shift in her chest. I'm not really a Hayes, she said quietly. Aren't you? You live in our homework, our land, share our table. You stood with us against armed men. If that doesn't make you family, I don't know what does. The only question is whether we make it legal. Clara's eyes widened. Legal? Adoption. Eleanor and I have discussed it. You're nearly of age anyway, so some might think it's strange, but we don't care about that. We want you to have our name officially, legally, to be our daughter in the eyes of the law, not just our hearts. The offer stunned Clara into silence. Adoption meant security, legitimacy, a permanent place in the world. It also meant trusting completely, allowing herself to believe this happiness could last. Think about it, Daniel said gently. No pressure, no rush. The offer stands whenever you're ready. That night, Clara found herself in the small cemetery at the edge of the property, standing before a tiny headstone marked Mary Elizabeth Hayes. She'd discovered it weeks ago, but had never asked about it. Now in the moonlight, she knelt beside it, running her fingers over the carved lamb. I would have liked to know you, she whispered to the stone. I would have been a good sister, I think. I would have taught you to be tough, but kind like your mother. Brave, but wise like your father. You would have been loved so fiercely. She was... Eleanor's voice came from behind her. Clara turned to find both Eleanor and Daniel standing there, having followed her. For 3 days, she was loved with an intensity that could have filled a lifetime. Tell me about her, Clara requested. They sat together in the grass beside the tiny grave, and Eleanor spoke of those 3 precious days, how Mary had Daniel's dark hair and Eleanor's blue eyes, how she'd gripped Daniel's finger with surprising strength, how her cry had sounded like a song to parents who'd waited so long to hear it. The fever took her so fast, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. One moment she was nursing, the next she was burning up. The doctor said it happens sometimes, that some babies just aren't meant for this world. We blamed ourselves, Daniel added, his own voice thick. Me for not writing faster for the doctor, Eleanor for not recognizing the fever sooner. It took years to forgive ourselves, to understand that love isn't always enough to save someone. Clara reached out, taking each of their hands. But it's enough to honor them, to remember them, to let their memory make us better. They sat in silence for a while, 3 people bound by loss and love, until Daniel spoke again. We didn't want to replace Mary with you, Clara. No one could. But loving you doesn't diminish our love for her. If anything, it honors it. Every child deserves to be loved, and we had love to give. Yes, Clara said quietly. Yes to the adoption. Yes to being your daughter. Yes to being a Hayes. Eleanor let out a sob that might have been joy or grief, or both, pulling Clara into a fierce embrace. Daniel wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stayed that way, a family sealed not by blood, but by choice, witnessed by the memory of the daughter they'd lost and the spirit of the one they'd found. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A fancy carriage out of place on the rough ranch roads pulled up to the house. From it emerged a well-dressed couple in their 50s, the woman clutching a handkerchief, the man standing stiffly formal. Clara, who'd been helping Eleanor with laundry, froze at the sight of them. "No," she breathed. "It can't be." "Clarissa?" Eleanor asked, alarmed by her reaction. "Who are they?" But Clara was already running toward the carriage, her face a mix of joy and disbelief. "Aunt Margaret, Uncle Patrick." The woman let out a cry and rushed forward, catching Clara in an embrace that nearly knocked them both over. "Clara! My dear girl, we thought you were dead." Daniel, drawn by the commotion, arrived to find Clara sobbing in the arms of strangers speaking rapidly in a mix of English and Irish Gaelic. Eleanor stood nearby, looking as confused as he felt. "Perhaps we should all go inside," Daniel suggested firmly. "This seems to be a conversation requiring privacy." Once seated in the parlor with Eleanor serving tea with hands that trembled slightly, the story emerged. Margaret and Patrick O'Sullivan were Clara's father's siblings who'd been traveling in California when the fever struck Galveston. By the time they'd received word and returned, Clara had vanished into the orphanage system. "We searched for 2 years," Patrick said, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "Every orphanage, every workhouse. They all said they had no record of Clara Sullivan. Because I was using my mother's maiden name, O'Brien," Clara explained. I thought you were dead too. The nuns said the fever took all my family." "The nuns lied," Margaret said bitterly. "Or were misinformed. We were very much alive and desperate to find you. We finally hired a detective, and he traced you through the auction records. That's how we learned about—" She paused, looking at Daniel and Eleanor with an expression that was part gratitude, part suspicion, "your current situation." The room fell silent, heavy with implication. Clara's relatives had come to claim her, as was their right. Everything the Hayes had built with her, everything they'd planned, suddenly stood on shaky ground. "You paid $100 for our niece," Patrick said carefully. "We're prepared to reimburse you, of course, with interest." "She's not for sale," Daniel said sharply, then caught himself. "I apologize. What I mean is Clara isn't property to be bought or sold. She's family." "Our family," Margaret countered. "Blood family." Clara stood abruptly, moving to stand between the two couples. "Stop. All of you stop." She turned to her aunt and uncle. "Where were you? For 2 years, where were you? We told you searching, in California, making your fortune in the gold fields while I worked 16-hour days in factories where girls died from the fumes. You were alive and I was alone." "We didn't know," Patrick began. "But they did." Clara pointed at Daniel and Eleanor. "They saw me on that auction block and saved me. They gave me a home, taught me to read accounts and ride horses and defend myself. They stood with me against men with guns who came to drag me back to hell. They chose me when they had no obligation to." Margaret's face crumpled. "We're your family, Clara. Your father was my baby brother. I promised him if anything happened, I'd care for you. And you can," Clara said more gently, "but not by taking me away. The Hayes are adopting me, legally. I'll be Clara Hayes, and that's my choice." Patrick's face reddened. "You're 14. You don't get to make that choice." "Don't I?" Clara's voice turned cold. "I've been making my own choices since I was 12. I chose to survive when it would have been easier to die. I chose to steal rather than submit. I chose to fight rather than run. And now I choose to stay with the people who've proven they'll fight for me." Eleanor moved to stand beside Clara, her presence a quiet support. Daniel flanked her other side. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Clara had chosen her position literally and figuratively. Margaret was crying openly now. We just wanted to save you, to give you the life your parents would have wanted. Then be happy for me, Clara said, her voice softening, because I have that life. Maybe not the way any of us imagined, but I have it. The tension in the room stretched until Patrick finally spoke. You'd still be our niece. We could visit, write letters. Of course, Clara said, relief evident in her voice. I'd love that. I thought I had no family left at all, and now I have more than I dreamed. What followed was a gradual thawing, though awkwardness remained. Margaret and Patrick shared stories of Clara's parents, filling in gaps in her memory, with tales of their courtship in Ireland, their brave journey to America, their dreams for their daughter. Your mother could sing like an angel, Margaret said, and your father would dance to her singing right there in the kitchen, not caring who saw. I remember, Clara said softly. I remember the singing. They stayed for 3 days, and slowly the two families began to blend. Patrick, it turned out, had made a modest fortune in California gold and was now investing in railroads. He offered to set up a trust for Clara's education, which Daniel initially resisted until Eleanor convinced him it wasn't charity, but family helping family. She should go to school, Margaret insisted. A proper finishing school. With her intelligence, she could be anything, a teacher, a nurse, maybe even one of those lady doctors they're starting to allow. That's Clara's decision, Eleanor said firmly. Whatever she chooses, we'll support. The night before they left, Margaret found Clara alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. I owe them an apology, Margaret said, sitting beside her niece. The haze. I came here thinking they'd taken advantage, bought you like property. But I see now they saved you. We saved each other, Clara corrected. They needed a daughter, and I needed parents. Sometimes God works in mysterious ways. Margaret studied her niece's profile. You've grown up so fast. Your mother would be proud of the woman you're becoming. I hope so. I hope they both would be. Can you forgive us for not being there when you needed us? Clara turned to face her aunt fully. There's nothing to forgive. You didn't know. But Aunt Margaret, you have to understand this is my home now. These are my parents now. I love that I have you and Uncle Patrick, but my life is here. Margaret nodded, wiping away tears. Your father was stubborn too. Once he made up his mind, nothing could change it. She pulled out a worn photograph. This was them on their wedding day. Clara took the photograph with trembling hands. Her parents stood stiffly formal in their best clothes, but their eyes sparkled with joy. She could see herself in her mother's face, her father's determined chin. Keep it, Margaret said. They'd want you to have it. The next morning, as the carriage prepared to leave, Patrick pulled Daniel aside. Take care of her, he said gruffly. She's all we have left of my brother. She's all we have, period, Daniel replied. I promise you she'll want for nothing, not love, not opportunity, not protection. Patrick nodded and surprised Daniel by offering his hand. Then we're family, all of us. Complicated, unconventional family, but family nonetheless. As the carriage rolled away, Clara stood between Daniel and Eleanor, waving until it disappeared into the distance. Eleanor noticed she was crying. Regrets? Eleanor asked gently. No, Clara said, wiping her eyes. Relief. And gratitude. A month ago I had no one. Now I have so much family, I don't know what to do with them all. Daniel chuckled. Welcome to the problem we've been praying for. The adoption proceedings were initiated the following week. Judge Harrison, an old friend of Daniel's father, agreed to expedite the process given the unusual circumstances. The whole county was buzzing with the news the childless Hayes couple adopting a 14-year-old girl they'd rescued from a labor auction. Not everyone approved. Mrs. Patterson made her disapproval known at church, speaking loudly about the unseemly haste and irregular circumstances to anyone who'd listen. But others, like Mr. Chen from the general store and Sheriff Coleman, made their support clear. Family comes in all forms, Chen said when Clara thanked him for his kindness. In China, we say a family with an old person has a treasure. Here, I think a family with a brave young woman has a different kind of treasure. As November arrived and the trial date loomed, Clara found her anxiety mixed with a strange anticipation. She would face Blackwood not as a scared runaway, but as Clara Hayes, daughter of Daniel, and Eleanor Hayes, niece of Patrick and Margaret O'Sullivan. She had a name, a family, a future. The night before they were to leave for Galveston and the trial, Daniel found Clara in his study, reading through law books he'd borrowed from Judge Harrison. "Looking for loopholes?" he asked. "Understanding the process," she replied. "Knowledge is power. You taught me that. I also taught you that courage is acting despite fear, not in its absence." Clara closed the book, looking up at him. "I'm terrified. What if his lawyer destroys me on the stand? What if the jury doesn't believe me?" Daniel sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "Do you know what Eleanor said to me the night before our wedding? She said she was terrified she'd disappoint me, that she wouldn't be the wife I deserved. I told her what I'm telling you now. The only way to disappoint me is to be less than yourself. Be honest, be brave, be Clara. That's enough." "Clara Hayes," she corrected with a small smile. "Clara Hayes," he agreed. "My daughter who faced down armed men with a poker and won. I think you can handle a few lawyers." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching clouds drift across the moon when she heard soft footsteps. Eleanor appeared in her doorway, carrying 2 cups of warm milk with honey. "Thought you might be awake," she said, handing Clara a cup. They sat together on Clara's bed, sipping their milk in comfortable silence until Eleanor spoke. "I was about your age when I testified at my own father's trial." Clara nearly dropped her cup. Eleanor had never spoken of her childhood before. "He was a drunk," Eleanor continued quietly. "A mean one. He killed my mother in one of his rages, though he claimed it was an accident. I was the only witness. I had to sit in that courtroom and tell strangers the worst moment of my life, while he stared at me with eyes that promised retribution." "What happened?" "He went to prison, died there 5 years later. And I went to live with an aunt who taught me that strength isn't about being unafraid, it's about doing what's right, despite the fear." Clara leaned against Eleanor's shoulder. "How do you bear it, the memories?" "By making better ones to overlay them. Every day with Daniel, every moment with you, they're like patches on a quilt covering the torn places with something beautiful." They sat together until dawn began to lighten the sky, 2 survivors finding comfort in shared understanding. The journey to Galveston felt both too long and too short. Clara sat between Daniel and Eleanor in the coach they'd hired her new dress, a respectable navy blue that Eleanor had insisted on feeling strange after months in simple ranch clothes. She looked like a proper young lady, which was exactly the point. "Remember," the prosecutor, Mr. Thornton, had advised, "you're not the girl from the docks anymore. You're a respectable rancher's daughter. Let them see that." As they entered Galveston, Clara felt her chest tighten. The familiar streets, the smell of the harbor, the sounds of the factories, they all threatened to pull her back into the scared girl she'd been. But then Daniel's hand covered hers steady and warm, and Eleanor began pointing out improvements to the city since their last visit, keeping Clara's mind occupied with trivial observations until the panic passed. The courthouse was an imposing building of gray stone and tall columns designed to intimidate. Crowds had gathered, drawn by the sensational nature of the trial, corruption, trafficking stolen documents. Newspaper reporters pushed forward, shouting questions that Daniel and Eleanor firmly deflected, keeping Clara between them like a shield. Inside the courtroom was packed. Clara recognized some faces from Blackwood's establishment girls who'd escaped or been freed when the scandal broke. They looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude that made her uncomfortable. She wasn't a hero. She'd just been trying to survive. Then Blackwood was brought in, and despite herself, Clara flinched. He was thinner than before, his fine clothes replaced with prison gray, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. When he saw her, his lips curved in a smile that promised this wasn't over. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Whitman," the bailiff announced, and the trial began. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically: the trafficking of minors, the forced labor, the brothels disguised as boarding houses, the elaborate network of bribes and blackmail that had protected Blackwood's empire. The documents Clara had stolen were presented as evidence, their authenticity verified by 3 different experts. Then it was Clara's turn to testify. As she walked to the witness stand, her legs felt like water, but she forced herself to move with the same determination that had carried her through the last months. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Mr. Thornton started with easy questions: her name, her age, her current residence. Then he guided her through her story from her parents' death, through her time in Blackwood's establishment, to her escape with the documents. "Why did you take the papers?" he asked. "Because I knew they were the only thing that could stop him," Claire replied. "Girls were dying, Mr. Thornton. 13, 14 years old, worked to death or worse. Someone had to do something." "And you thought you, a 13-year-old girl, could stop Marcus Blackwood?" "I thought I had to try." "If not me, then who?" The defense attorney, a thin man named Murdoch with eyes like a ferret, stood for cross-examination. Clara braced herself. "Miss Hayes, is it now?" He began, his tone suggesting the name was a lie. "Or is it Sullivan O'Brien? You seem to have trouble keeping your name straight." "My birth name was Clara Sullivan," she replied calmly. "I used O'Brien for safety while alone in the city. I am now legally Clara Hayes, adopted by Daniel and Eleanor Hayes." "Adopted? How convenient. Tell me, how much did the Hayes family pay for you?" "Objection," Thornton called out. "Relevance." "Goes to the witness's credibility, Your Honor," Murdoch replied smoothly. "If she was bought and paid, for her testimony might be similarly purchased." Judge Whitman frowned but allowed it. "Answer the question." Clara lifted her chin. "Mr. Hayes paid $100 to free me from a labor auction where your client's brother was attempting to purchase me. It was a rescue, not a purchase." $100, Murdoch mused. "That's quite a sum. What makes you worth so much, Miss Hayes?" The implication in his tone was ugly, and Clara saw Daniel start to rise before Eleanor pulled him back down. "I wouldn't know," Clara replied steadily. "You'd have to ask Mr. Hayes why he values human freedom so highly." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Score 1 for Clara. Murdoch's eyes narrowed. "You claim you were forced to work in my client's establishment. Do you have any proof you didn't seek employment there voluntarily?" "Beyond the fact that I was 13 years old. Girls younger than that seek employment in various establishments. Times are hard." Clara felt her anger rising, but kept it controlled. "Girls younger than that are forced into slavery because men like your client profit from their desperation. I didn't seek employment. I was trapped, threatened, and would have been killed if I hadn't escaped." "So you say. But you did escape, didn't you? And you stole from my client in the process." "I took evidence of his crimes." "You took private property. You're a thief, Miss Hayes. Why should this jury believe anything an admitted thief says?" This was the moment Clara had dreaded. But as she looked at Murdoch's smug face, something shifted in her. She thought of Eleanor facing down her father's killer, of Daniel, standing against Garrett, of her parents crossing an ocean for a better life. "I am many things, Mr. Murdoch," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "I'm an orphan who survived when the world wanted me to disappear. I'm a girl who fought back when men tried to break me. I'm a daughter who found parents when I'd lost all hope. And yes, I'm someone who took papers that proved your client enslaved children. If that makes me a thief, then I'm proud to be one. But I am not, and have never been a liar." The courtroom erupted in whispers until Judge Whitman called for order. Murdoch tried several more attacks, but Clara met each one with the same steady courage. When he finally frustratedly dismissed her, she walked back to her seat on legs that shook, but her head was high. The trial continued for 3 more days. Other girls testified their stories, heartbreakingly similar to Clara's. The financial records were examined, showing the vast network of corruption Blackwood had orchestrated. Character witnesses spoke for Clara, including Sheriff Coleman, who traveled from Columbus to testify about her courage during Blackwood's attack on the ranch. On the final day, Blackwood himself took the stand, maintaining his innocence, claiming the girls had been willing employees and that Clara was a disturbed child who'd manufactured evidence against him. But under Thornton's fierce cross-examination, his story crumbled like wet paper. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. As the verdict was read, Clara felt Eleanor's hand squeeze hers on one side, Daniel's steady presence on the other. Blackwood was led away in chains, but not before his eyes found Clara one last time. She met his gaze steadily, no longer the frightened girl he'd tried to destroy. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Miss Hayes, how do you feel about the verdict? Clara paused, thinking of all the girls who hadn't escaped, who hadn't survived to see this day. Justice was served, but the work isn't done. There are more Blackwoods out there, more girls who need help. This is just the beginning. Will you continue to fight for them? Another reporter asked. Clara looked at Daniel and Eleanor, who nodded their support. Yes, she said simply. I will. As they made their way back to their hotel, planning to return to Columbus the next day, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for herself, but for others like her. She testified she'd survived, she'd won. And now she had a platform, a voice, a family to support her in whatever came next. That night, as they celebrated quietly in the hotel dining room, Daniel raised his glass. To Clara Hayes Trubm, he said, our daughter who faced down the devil himself and won. To family, Eleanor added, born of choice and sealed by courage. Clara raised her own glass, thinking of her birth parents who'd given her life and her chosen parents who'd given her a future. To second chances, she said, and to the courage to take them. As they clinked glasses, Clara realized that the scared girl who'd stood on that auction platform months ago was gone. In her place stood Clara Hayes' daughter, survivor, and fighter for justice. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she was eager to find out. The journey back to Columbus should have been triumphant, but Clara found herself strangely subdued as the carriage rolled through the Texas countryside. The trial's outcome had lifted a weight she'd carried for 2 years, yet in its absence she discovered other burdens she hadn't noticed before. You're too quiet, Eleanor observed, studying Clara's face with maternal concern. What's troubling you? Clara watched the landscape blur past the window, searching for words to express the hollow feeling in her chest. At the courthouse, those other girls, they looked at me like I was some kind of savior. But I'm not. I just got lucky. Lucky. Daniel's voice held a note of incredulity. You fought for your freedom, risked your life for evidence, and stood up to corruption that ran deeper than anyone imagined. That's not luck, Clara. That's courage. But what about the ones who didn't get out? Clara turned from the window, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. What about the girls who are still trapped in places like Blackwoods? I saved myself, but I couldn't save them. Eleanor reached across the carriage to take Clara's hand. You can't carry the weight of every injustice on your shoulders, dear one. You're 15 years old. Almost 15, Clara corrected automatically. Her birthday was still weeks away. Almost 15, Eleanor agreed with a small smile. You've already done more than most people do in a lifetime. It's all right to just be young for a while. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her fight wasn't over. That night, when they stopped at an inn in Hempstead, she found herself writing letters to the girls she'd known in Blackwood's establishment using addresses the prosecutor had provided. She didn't know if the letters would reach them or if the girls could even read, but she needed to try. Dear Sarah, she wrote to a girl who'd arrived just days before Clara's escape. I hope this letter finds you free and safe. Please know that someone remembers you, that your story matters, that you are not forgotten. Daniel found her there hours later, surrounded by completed letters, her fingers stained with ink. He sat beside her without speaking, reading over her shoulder. You want to help them all, he said softly. Shouldn't I have so much now, family, safety, a future. How can I enjoy it knowing they might have nothing? Daniel was quiet for a moment, then spoke with careful deliberation. When I was young, maybe 20, I watched a herd of cattle caught in a flash flood. Most drowned, but I managed to pull 3 calves to safety. For months afterward, I tortured myself thinking about all the ones I couldn't save. My father told me something I've never forgotten. You can't save them all, but you can save some. And for those some, you're everything. Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. 3 calves, she repeated. Was it worth it? Those 3 calves became the foundation of our current herd. Every cow we own today descends from them. So yes, it was worth it. Small acts can have consequences we never imagine. When they finally arrived home, the ranch felt different to Clara, smaller somehow, after the vastness of what she'd witnessed in Galveston, but also safer, more precious. She stood on the porch, breathing in the familiar scents of grass and cattle earth and growing things. "Welcome home," Eleanor said, and Clara realized with a start that it truly was home now. Not just a refuge or a temporary shelter, but home. The adoption was finalized the following week in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. Judge Harrison presided, his weathered face kind as he asked Clara if she understood what she was agreeing to. "I understand I'm choosing to become the legal daughter of Daniel and Eleanor Hayes," Clara said clearly. "I understand they'll have parental rights over me until I reach majority, and I understand that I'm accepting the Hayes name permanently." "And you do this of your own free will?" "I do." When Judge Harrison declared the adoption final, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a clicking into place like a key finally finding its lock. She was Clara Hayes now, officially, legally, irrevocably. The small celebration afterward at the ranch included Sheriff Coleman, Mr. Chen Samuel the foreman, and surprisingly Mrs. Patterson. The minister's wife approached Clara with an expression of chagrin. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "I was unkind when you first arrived. I made assumptions that were both uncharitable and wrong." Clara studied the older woman's face, seeing the effort this apology cost her. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for saying so. You conducted yourself with remarkable dignity at the trial. The whole county's talking about it." Mrs. Patterson paused, then added with apparent difficulty, "We're proud to have you as part of our community." As the woman walked away, Eleanor whispered, "That might be the closest to a compliment Agnes Patterson has ever given anyone." "Should I feel honored?" Clara asked with a hint of her old humor. "Deeply," Daniel replied, his eyes twinkling. Winter settled over Texas with unusual severity that year. By December, ice glazed the water troughs each morning and the cattle huddled together for warmth. Clara threw herself into ranch work with renewed vigor, learning to predict weather changes by the behavior of the animals, to doctor sick calves, to read the subtle signs of the land. One particularly bitter evening, as she helped Daniel and Samuel bring the horses into the barn, before a threatening storm, Samuel made an observation that stopped her cold. "You've got the instincts for this," he said, watching her calm a skittish mare with a gentle hand and soft words. "Not everyone does. Some learn the mechanics of ranching, but you understand the spirit of it." "Samuel doesn't give compliments lightly," Daniel noted after the foreman had gone. "He's right, though. You have a gift with the animals." Clara stroked the mare's neck, considering. "They're honest. Animals don't pretend or manipulate. If they trust you, it's real. If they don't, they let you know immediately." "Is that why you still struggle to trust people?" Daniel asked gently. Clara's hand stilled on the horse. "I trust you and Eleanor. But sometimes I wake up afraid it's all a dream, that I'll open my eyes and be back in that warehouse waiting to be sold again." She turned to face him. "Does that make me ungrateful?" "It makes you human," Daniel replied. "Trust that's been broken takes time to rebuild. We're not going anywhere, Clara. However long it takes for you to believe that completely, we'll be here." That night, the threatened storm arrived with a vengeance. Wind howled around the house like a living thing, and sleet hammered against the windows. Clara lay in her bed listening to the fury outside when she heard something else a pounding at the front door, desperate and insistent. She grabbed her wrapper and crept to the landing, where she found Daniel already descending the stairs, rifle in hand. Eleanor appeared beside Clara. Both of them tense with memory of the last time someone came to their door at night. Daniel peered through the window, then quickly unlocked the door. A figure stumbled in, so covered in ice and mud as to be almost unrecognizable. It wasn't until the person pushed back her sodden hood that Clara gasped in recognition. "Sarah?" It was indeed Sarah, the young girl from Blackwood's establishment, the one Clara had written to. She was skeletal thin, her lips blue with cold, her whole body shaking violently. "Clara," she managed through chattering teeth, "you said, in your letter, you said if I ever needed help." She collapsed before she could finish. Daniel caught her, lifting her easily. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her to the fire while Eleanor ran for blankets and warm clothes. "How did you get here?" Clara asked, kneeling beside Sarah as Eleanor worked to remove her frozen clothes. "Walked, from Galveston. Took weeks." Sarah's eyes, huge in her gaunt face, fixed on Clara with desperate hope. They wanted to put me in another house, another man's. I ran. Shh, Eleanor soothed, wrapping Sarah in warm blankets. You're safe now. No more talking until we get you warm. They worked through the night, slowly bringing life back to Sarah's frozen limbs. She'd suffered frostbite on several toes, and Clara could see the signs of long hunger in her protruding bones and hollow cheeks. But she was alive, and as the hours passed, color slowly returned to her face. When dawn broke gray and bitter through the still falling sleet, Sarah finally told her story fully. After Blackwood's conviction, his establishment had been shut down, but the girls had simply been transferred to other houses, other owners. The cycle continued, just with different faces. When your letter came, I couldn't believe it, Sarah whispered. Someone remembered me. Someone cared. I kept it hidden, read it so many times I memorized every word. When they said I was being sold to a house in Houston, I knew I had to run. You walked from Galveston in winter. Eleanor's voice held awe and horror in equal measure. I hid during the day, walked at night, begged food when I could, stole when I couldn't. Sarah's eyes found Clara's. You did it. You escaped and made something of yourself. I thought maybe I could too. Daniel and Eleanor exchanged glances over Sarah's head, a silent conversation passing between them. Clara held her breath, hoping. Well, Eleanor said briskly, first things first. You need food rest and proper medical attention for those feet. We'll send for Dr. Morrison in the morning. After that, we'll figure out the rest. I can work, Sarah said desperately. I'm good with sewing and I can clean and… Child, Daniel interrupted gently. You don't need to earn your place here. You need to heal. The rest can wait. Sarah began to cry, then great gasping sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Clara held her while she wept, understanding too well the relief of finally being safe, the overwhelming feeling of unexpected kindness after so much cruelty. Over the following days, Sarah slowly began to recover. Dr. Morrison, a competent man despite his unfortunate name, no relation to Jake Morrison, he assured them, treated her frostbite and prescribed rest and nourishing food. The damage wasn't as severe as they'd feared, though she'd likely always have some sensitivity to cold in the affected toes. Sarah was 2 years younger than Clara, just 12, but like Clara, her eyes held the weight of experiences no child should have. She jumped at sudden movements, hoarded food in her room, until Eleanor gently explained it wasn't necessary and refused to be alone with any of the male ranch hands. She needs time, Eleanor said to Clara one evening as they prepared dinner together. Sarah curled in a chair by the fire, reading one of Clara's books with intense concentration. She needs safety, Clara corrected. Time doesn't heal unless you feel safe during it. Eleanor studied her adopted daughter with those perceptive blue eyes. Speaking from experience, every day I've been here has healed something in me, Clara admitted, but only because I knew I was safe to heal. Word of Sarah's arrival spread through the county with predictable speed. Some applauded the Hayes family's charity. Others whispered about their ranch becoming a refuge for fallen girls. Clara overheard two women at the general store discussing it in hushed, scandalized tones. First the one they bought, now this new girl. Mark my words, they're inviting trouble. The Hayes can't have children of their own, the other replied knowingly. This is their way of filling that void, though why they'd choose such damaged goods. Clara's hands clenched into fists, but before she could confront them, Mr. Chen appeared at her elbow. Some people, he said just loudly enough for the women to hear, see only surfaces. They miss the gold beneath because they're too busy gossiping about the dirt on top. He smiled at the women with perfectly polite menace. Ladies, were you planning to make purchases today or just spread poison? They left hastily, and Clara felt a rush of gratitude for the quiet shopkeeper. Thank you, she said. No thanks needed. You and young Sarah, you remind me of my own journey here. People said cruel things about Chinese immigrants, too. Called us damaged, dangerous, different. But Mr. Hayes gave me credit when I started this store, trusted me when others wouldn't. Good people recognize other good people regardless of their struggles. That evening, Clara found Sarah crying in her room, clutching a letter. What's wrong? Clara asked, sitting on the bed beside her. I wrote to my sister, Sarah said through her tears. She's still in Houston in one of the houses. I thought maybe, but she wrote back saying I'm dead to her, that by running I've shamed her, made things worse for the other girls. Clara pulled Sarah into her arms, remembering her own isolation, the weight of being alone in the world. Family isn't always blood, she said softly. Sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born to. Like you and the Hayes, and exactly like that. And like you with us if you want. Sarah pulled back to look at her. They let me stay, Clara pointed out. And I came with a lot more trouble than you did. As if to prove her point, the next morning brought unexpected visitors. A well-dressed man in a city suit arrived with two companions presenting documents to Daniel. Mr. Hayes, I represent the interests of certain parties in Houston who have legal claim to the girl Sarah Warner. She's a runaway contracted to service until her 18th birthday. Daniel examined the papers with deliberate slowness, while Clara felt her heart race. They couldn't lose Sarah now, not when she'd just begun to feel safe. These papers, Daniel said finally, claim Sarah owes a debt of $200 for room board and training. That's correct? And if that debt were paid, the man's eyes gleamed with greed, then naturally the contract would be dissolved. Clara, Daniel said without looking at her, fetch my checkbook. Clara flew to his study, understanding immediately what he intended. When she returned, Eleanor and Sarah had joined them, Sarah trembling behind Eleanor's protective presence. Daniel wrote the check with steady hands, though Clara knew the amount would strain their finances, especially after the damage from Blackwood's attack. He handed it to the man with a look of barely concealed disgust. Take your blood money and get off my land. And know this, if you or anyone else comes for this girl again, you'll answer to me, to Sheriff Coleman, and to every decent person in this county. The man pocketed the check with a smirk. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Hayes, though I wonder how many more strays you can afford to collect. After they left, Daniel turned to find Sarah staring at him with shock. You paid all that money. For me. I paid for your freedom, Daniel corrected gently. Just as I did for Clara. Every person deserves a chance at a real life. Sarah began to sob, falling to her knees, but Eleanor quickly pulled her up. None of that, she said firmly. We don't kneel in this house. We stand together. That night, Clara found Daniel in his study going over the account books with a furrowed brow. We're going to be tight this winter, he admitted when she asked. But we'll manage. We always do. I could help, Clara offered. My aunt and uncle, they offered to set up a trust for my education. Maybe we could use some of that. No, Daniel said firmly. That money is for your future. We don't solve today's problems by mortgaging tomorrow's possibilities. But Sarah is our responsibility now, just as you are. We'll find a way. And they did. Clara and Sarah took on extra work making preserves and quilts to sell in town. Eleanor expanded her garden planning for extra produce to sell come spring. Daniel and Samuel worked longer hours breaking horses for sale to the army fort nearby. Christmas approached with little fanfare. Money was too tight for elaborate celebrations. But on Christmas Eve, as they sat around the fire, Daniel, Eleanor, Clara, and Sarah, something magical happened. Sarah, who barely spoke above a whisper, began to sing. Her voice was pure and clear, a soprano that seemed to come from heaven itself. She sang an old Irish carol that Clara remembered her mother singing, and Clara found herself joining in her alto, harmonizing with Sarah's soprano. Eleanor added her voice, and finally Daniel's deep bass completed the quartet. When they finished, there were tears on every face. My mother taught me to sing, Sarah said softly. Before she died, she said my voice was a gift from God, and that someday it would save me. She looked around at the faces of her new family. I think she was right. That moment crystallized something for Clara. They were no longer separate people brought together by circumstance. They were truly a family. Unconventional, perhaps, forged in hardship rather than blood, but no less real for it. The winter was hard, but they endured it together. Sarah slowly came out of her shell, her natural sweetness emerging as the fear receded. She had a gift not just for singing, but for seeing the good in people, for bringing out their better natures. Even the skeptical ranch hands were won over by her genuine kindness. One day in late January, Clara was teaching Sarah to ride when a lone horseman approached. Clara tensed her hand, moving instinctively to the rifle Daniel insisted she carry. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized him. Patrick O'Sullivan? Her uncle. Uncle Patrick! She dismounted quickly, running to greet him. "What are you doing here?" Patrick's face was grave as he dismounted. "I have news, Clara, both good and bad. Perhaps we should go inside." Once gathered in the parlor, Patrick delivered his news. The good Marcus Blackwood had been killed in prison, shanked by another inmate who had a daughter of his own. The bad his brother Josiah Blackwood, the one from the auction, was gathering support to challenge the adoptions, claiming the Hayes family was creating an illegal refuge for runaway servants. "He's making noise in Austin," Patrick explained. "Claims you're harboring fugitives, corrupting the labor contract system. He's got money and connections." Daniel's face darkened. "Let him come. We've done everything legally." "Have you?" Patrick asked, looking at Sarah. "Her contract was paid in full," Daniel replied firmly. "I have the receipt." Patrick relaxed slightly. "Good. That's good. But Blackwood won't stop there. He's vindictive, and he blames Clara for his brother's downfall." "Then we fight," Eleanor said with quiet determination. "We fought before." "Actually, Patrick said, reaching into his jacket. "That's why I'm here. Margaret and I want to help." He pulled out a bank draft that made everyone gasp. "Consider it an investment in family." The amount was enough to pay off the ranch's mortgage and have plenty left over. Daniel immediately shook his head. "We can't accept this." "You can, and you will," Patrick said firmly. "Clara is our blood, which makes you family too. And family helps family. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've been following the story in the papers. What you're doing here, taking in these girls, giving them real homes and futures, it's important work that deserves support." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "Uncle Patrick—" "No tears," he said gruffly. "Your aunt would never forgive me if I made you cry. She sends her love by the way and several books she thought you and Sarah might enjoy." That evening, after Patrick had left with promises to return soon with Margaret, the family sat together absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Financial security meant they could not only weather Blackwood's challenge, but could potentially help more girls like Sarah. "We could make it official," Clara said suddenly. "Create a proper refuge, a place where girls escaping situations like ours can come to heal, learn skills, find families." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "A sanctuary." "The Hayes home," Daniel said thoughtfully. "For girls who need second chances." Sarah spoke up shyly. "Could I help? I mean, I know what they're going through. Maybe I could, I don't know, be proof that it gets better." Clara reached over to squeeze her hand. "You already are proof just by surviving." As winter gave way to spring, their plans began to take shape. Word spread carefully, quietly through networks Clara had maintained from her time in Galveston. Girls began to arrive, some brought by sympathetic lawmen, others finding their own way like Sarah had. Not all stayed. Some couldn't adjust to the structure and safety after years of chaos. Others left to seek families of their own once they'd healed enough. But many remained, finding in the Hayes Ranch something they'd never had a true home. By the time Clara's 15th birthday arrived in March, the ranch housed 6 girls besides herself and Sarah. Each had a story of survival, each brought unique skills and perspectives. The main house had been expanded with Patrick and Margaret's help, adding a dormitory wing. The night of Clara's birthday, as they all gathered for dinner, a raucous affair with 12 people around the table, Clara looked around in wonder. A year ago, she'd stood on an auction block with no hope and no future. Now she was surrounded by family, both chosen and blood engaged in work that mattered. Eleanor raised her glass. "To Clara Hayes, who changed all our lives by having the courage to survive." "To all of us," Clara corrected, raising her own glass, "for having the courage to thrive." As the sun set over the ranch that had become a sanctuary, Clara realized that her story, their story, was far from over. Josiah Blackwood was still out there planning his challenge. More girls would need their help. The work would be hard, the opposition fierce. But looking around the table at the faces of her family, Daniel's quiet strength, Eleanor's fierce compassion, Sarah's gentle resilience, and all the others who'd found their way here, Clara knew they were ready for whatever came next. They'd built something precious here, something worth fighting for. The Hayes home for second chances, as it would come to be known, had begun with one desperate bid at a terrible auction. Now it stood as a beacon of hope in a dark world, proof that love could triumph over commerce, that human dignity was worth any price, and that sometimes the families we choose are the strongest ones of all. As laughter filled the house and music from Sarah's sweet voice drifted through the windows, Clara stepped onto the porch to watch the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. She thought of her birth parents, hoping they'd be proud. She thought of Mary Elizabeth Hayes, the baby who'd lived only 3 days, but whose memory had helped create space for so much love. She thought of all the girls still trapped, still hoping, still surviving. "We're coming for you," she whispered to the night. "Hold on, we're coming." Behind her, Daniel appeared, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Planning to save the world, daughter. Clara leaned into his solid presence, drawing strength from the man who'd shown her what a father could be. "Maybe not the whole world, but our corner of it." "Yes. That's my girl," he said with quiet pride. "That's my Clara." As they stood together watching the night deepen, neither knew that their greatest challenges and greatest triumphs still lay ahead. But for that moment in the peace of the ranch that had become a haven, they were simply father and daughter, united in purpose and love, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The challenge from Josiah Blackwood came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after Clara's birthday, Sheriff Coleman arrived at the ranch with a grim expression and official documents that made Daniel's jaw tighten with anger. "He's petitioned the state legislature," Coleman explained, spreading the papers across Daniel's desk. "Claims you're running an illegal operation harboring fugitives and corrupting the labor contract system. He's demanding an investigation and the immediate return of all girls to their contracted employers." Clara, who'd been summoned along with Eleanor, felt her blood run cold. "He can't do that. We paid Sarah's debt. The others came here freely." Blackwood's arguing that minors can't make such decisions, that you're essentially stealing property. Coleman's disgust was evident. He's also suggesting improper relationships given that you have young girls living with a married couple in ranch hands. Eleanor gasped in outrage. "How dare he?" "It's what men like him do," Daniel said quietly, his voice controlled but dangerous. "They throw mud and hope something sticks. When is the hearing?" 3 weeks, in Austin. You'll need to appear before a legislative committee." Coleman paused, then added, "Blackwood's hired Theodore Ashford as his lawyer." Clara's heart sank. Theodore Ashford was known throughout Texas as a ruthless legal mind who'd never lost a case. He specialized in destroying reputations, turning victims into villains with surgical precision. That evening, the entire household gathered in the parlor. The 6 girls who'd joined them, Sarah, of course, but also Mary, Rebecca, Louise, Anne, and Catherine, sat in a circle of chairs, their faces anxious. Clara had insisted they all be told the truth. "We're going to fight this," Daniel said firmly. "But you need to know what we're facing. Blackwood wants to send you all back to the situations you escaped from." "I'll die first," Rebecca said flatly. She was 16, had arrived 3 weeks ago with scars on her back from repeated beatings. "I'll throw myself in the river before I go back." "No one's dying and no one's going back," Eleanor said with fierce determination. "We'll find a way." "How?" Louise asked. She was the youngest at 11, rescued from a factory where she'd been slowly dying from the chemical fumes. "Men like Blackwood always win." "Not always," Clara said, standing. "They win when good people don't fight back, when we're isolated, afraid alone. But we're none of those things." She looked around the circle. "We're together. We have resources. And we have the truth." "The truth doesn't always matter in court," Anne pointed out bitterly. She was 13, had been training to be a pickpocket before finding her way to the ranch. "Then we make it matter," Claire replied. "We make it impossible to ignore." Over the next days, they prepared with military precision. Patrick and Margaret arrived from Houston, bringing with them a young lawyer named James Thornton, the same prosecutor who'd handled Marcus Blackwood's trial. I owe you a debt, Thornton told Clara. That case made my career, but more importantly, it opened my eyes to injustices I'd been blind to. When I heard Josiah was coming after you, I knew I had to help. They spent long hours preparing testimony, gathering documents, collecting character witnesses. But Clara knew it might not be enough. Ashford was too skilled, Blackwood's connections too strong. They needed something more. The answer came from an unexpected source. Catherine, who'd barely spoken since arriving 2 weeks prior, approached Clara one evening with trembling hands. "I have something," she whispered, "something that might help." She produced a small leather journal, worn and water-stained. "I worked in Josiah Blackwood's house for 2 years before I ran. I kept records of everything, every girl he sold, every official he bribed, every law he broke." Clara's hands shook as she opened the journal. The entries were meticulous, dated, detailed. It was damning beyond belief. "Catherine, this is—" "Why didn't you say anything before?" "I was scared," Catherine admitted. "I thought if I just stayed quiet, disappeared here, he'd forget about me. But if he's coming for all of us—" She straightened her thin shoulders. "I won't let him win." Thornton nearly wept when he saw the journal. "This changes everything. With this, we're not just defending, we're attacking." The trip to Austin required careful planning. They couldn't bring all the girls, it would be too dangerous, too expensive. In the end, it was decided that Daniel, Eleanor, Clara, and Sarah would go along with Patrick, Margaret, and Thornton. Samuel would stay behind to protect the ranch and the other girls. The night before they left, the girls staying behind gathered around Clara and Sarah. "You're speaking for all of us," Rebecca said solemnly. "Every girl who's ever been trapped, sold, used. Don't let them make us invisible." "I won't," Clara promised, though the weight of responsibility felt crushing. Austin was larger than Clara had imagined, the state capital bustling with politicians, businessmen, and influence peddlers. The hotel where they stayed was grand, but Clara couldn't appreciate its elegance. Her mind was focused entirely on the next day's hearing. That evening, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Sarah joined her. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked. "Terrified," Clara admitted. "Last time I just had to tell my own story. Now I'm responsible for everyone's." "You were responsible then too," Sarah pointed out. "You just didn't know it yet. Every girl who got free because of what you did in Marcus Blackwood's trial, you were speaking for them too." Before Clara could respond, a knock came at their door. Eleanor answered to find a well-dressed woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "My name is Victoria Ashford," the woman said, and Clara's blood ran cold. "I'm Theodore's wife. May I come in?" Daniel stepped forward protectively, but the woman raised her hand. "Please, I mean no harm. In fact, I've come to help." They allowed her in warily. Victoria Ashford sat primly on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap. "My husband is brilliant," she began without preamble. "Also ruthless, ambitious, and utterly without conscience. I've watched him destroy innocent people for 30 years, telling myself it was just his profession. But when he took this case, when he told me gleefully how he'd destroy those meddling do-gooders and their collection of whores—" Her voice broke slightly. "I have a daughter, you see. She's 15, the same age as you, Clara." "What are you saying?" Eleanor asked carefully. Victoria reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "My husband's strategy. Every argument he plans to make, every witness he'll call, every dirty trick he intends to play. I've lived with him long enough to know how he thinks." She stood. "I won't testify against him, I'm still his wife. But perhaps this information might accidentally find its way into the right hands." She left as quickly as she'd come, leaving them staring at the folder in stunned silence. "It could be a trap," Patrick said. "Look at it," Clara said. "If it's real, we need to know. If it's false, we'll recognize the lies." Thornton spent the night reviewing the documents, cross-referencing with Catherine's journal and their own preparations. By dawn, his eyes were red-rimmed but triumphant. "She's given us everything. With this, we can counter every move Ashford makes." The legislative hearing convened in an imposing room with high ceilings and portraits of stern men looking down from the walls. The committee consisted of 5 legislators, all male, all wearing expressions of barely concealed boredom. Clara recognized the look they'd already made up their minds, or been paid to. Josiah Blackwood sat at the plaintiff's table, his similarity to his dead brother making Clara's skin crawl. Theodore Ashford stood beside him, tall and distinguished with the confidence of a man who'd never lost. "Gentlemen of the committee," Ashford began, his voice resonating with authority. "We're here today to address a dangerous precedent being set in Columbus, Texas. Under the guise of charity, the Hayes family is systematically undermining the legal labor contract system that keeps our economy functioning." He painted a picture of chaos and lawlessness, of girls abandoning their legal obligations, of honest businessmen being robbed of their investments. He was persuasive, Clara had to admit, making their sanctuary sound like a den of thieves and radicals. But Thornton was ready. As Ashford spoke, he calmly arranged documents on his table, each one a rebuttal to the claims being made. When his turn came, he stood slowly, deliberately. "Mr. Ashford speaks of legal contracts and economic systems," Thornton began. "But let's discuss what these contracts actually entail." He picked up a document. "This is Sarah Warner's contract. She was sold at age 10, sold gentlemen to work 18 hours a day in conditions that killed 3 girls in the span of 2 months. Is this the system we're defending?" He continued methodically, using Catherine's journal to detail Josiah Blackwood's own crimes. Bribery, trafficking of minors, forged documents claiming orphan status for girls whose parents were simply too poor to fight back. Ashford objected repeatedly, but Thornton had anticipated each objection thanks to Victoria's information. He countered every argument, turned every accusation back on Blackwood. Then it was Clara's turn to testify. She stood smoothing her dress, a respectable blue wool that Eleanor had insisted on, and walked to the witness chair with her head high. "State your name for the record," the committee chairman said, sounding bored. "Clara Hayes, formerly Clara Sullivan. And you're the girl who was purchased by Daniel Hayes." "I was freed by Daniel Hayes," Clara corrected firmly. "Purchased implies I was property. I am not and never was property, despite what men like Josiah Blackwood believe." Ashford stood for cross-examination, and Clara saw something flicker in his eyes, uncertainty. His wife's betrayal had shaken him. "Miss, Hayes," he said, the pause deliberate, "you admit to stealing documents from Marcus Blackwood." "I admit to taking evidence of his crimes, yes. Theft is theft, regardless of motivation." "And slavery is slavery, regardless of what you call it," Clara shot back. "Would you condemn a slave for stealing her freedom papers?" A murmur ran through the watching crowd. The committee members shifted uncomfortably. Ashford tried another approach. "You claim the Hayes Ranch is a legitimate sanctuary, but isn't it true that you harbor girls who've broken legal contracts?" "We shelter children who've escaped abuse," Clara replied. "If the law protects those who abuse children, then the law is wrong. You can't simply decide which laws to follow." "The Fugitive Slave Act was law," Clara interrupted. "Was it right?" "The law once said women couldn't vote, couldn't own property. Was that right? Laws are made by men, Mr. Ashford, and men are fallible. Conscience must sometimes supersede statute." One of the committee members, younger than the others, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting we ignore the law?" "I'm suggesting we change it," Clara said, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm suggesting we stop allowing the sale of children under the pretense of labor contracts. I'm suggesting we protect the vulnerable instead of those who exploit them." Sarah testified next, her sweet voice describing the horrors she'd endured in heartbreaking detail. Even the hostile committee members looked uncomfortable as she spoke of girls dying from overwork, of beatings, of worse things that she could only allude to. Eleanor testified about the transformation she'd witnessed in the girls they'd taken and how they'd flourished when given safety and education. Daniel spoke of the economic benefits of having educated, willing workers rather than enslaved, broken ones. Then came the surprise witness. Victoria Ashford walked into the room. Her husband's face went white. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" She didn't look at him, instead addressing the committee. "I'm here as a mother and a citizen concerned about the welfare of children in our state." She pulled out a document. "This is a letter from my husband to Josiah Blackwood promising to destroy the Hayes family in exchange for a percentage of Blackwood's business interests." The room erupted. Ashford was on his feet shouting about marital privilege and inadmissible evidence. Blackwood was cursing. The committee chairman was banging his gavel. When order was restored, Victoria continued calmly. I've watched my husband pervert justice for 30 years. I will not watch him destroy people who are trying to save children. Yes, I'll likely be divorced for this, but I'll sleep peacefully knowing I finally did the right thing. She left amid chaos. Ashford was too shaken to continue effectively, his remaining arguments falling flat. When Thornton presented Catherine's journal as final evidence detailing Josiah Blackwood's own extensive crimes, the case was essentially over. The committee recessed for deliberation. Clara and her family waited in agonizing suspense for 3 hours before being called back. The committee chairman stood, his expression grave. After reviewing the evidence, this committee finds no grounds for action against the Hayes family. Furthermore, we recommend that Mr. Josiah Blackwood be investigated for his own violations of state law. He paused, then looked directly at Clara. Miss Hayes, your testimony was illuminating. This committee will be recommending new legislation to prevent the exploitation of minors through fraudulent labor contracts. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. Eleanor caught her, holding her up as the room erupted in celebration. They'd won. More than won, they'd changed things. Josiah Blackwood stormed out, but not before passing close to Clara. This isn't over, he hissed. Yes, it is, Sheriff Coleman said, appearing with 2 Austin policemen. Josiah Blackwood, you're under arrest for bribery, trafficking, and conspiracy. He smiled at Clara. Catherine's journal was very thorough. The Austin authorities were quite interested. As Blackwood was led away in chains, Clara felt a chapter of her life closing. The Blackwood brothers who'd caused so much suffering were finished. That evening, they celebrated at a restaurant in Austin. Patrick raised his glass, repeatedly toasting their victory. But Clara found herself oddly subdued. What's troubling you? Margaret asked, noting her mood. Victoria Ashford, Clara replied. She sacrificed everything to help us. Her marriage, her position in society, probably her financial security. Sometimes doing right costs everything, Eleanor said gently. But living with doing wrong costs even more. Before they left Austin, Clara insisted on visiting Victoria Ashford. They found her at a modest boarding house, her elegant clothes replaced with simple attire, but her expression peaceful. I wanted to thank you, Clara said. What I did was 30 years overdue, Victoria interrupted. But thank you for being the catalyst, seeing you fight for those girls, seeing your courage. It shamed me into finding my own. What will you do now? Victoria smiled. My sister runs a school in San Antonio. I'm going to teach there. It's time I did something useful with my life. The journey home was triumphant. Word had already spread to Columbus about their victory, and they arrived to find the ranch decorated with banners and ribbons. The girls who'd stayed behind ran out to meet them, tears of relief and joy streaming down their faces. We did it, Rebecca kept saying. We actually did it. That night, as the household settled after celebration, Clara walked alone to the small cemetery. She knelt by Mary Elizabeth's grave, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked. Your parents fought for me, she told the tiny headstone. They gave me the family you never got to be part of. I hope wherever you are, you know how loved you are, how your memory inspired something beautiful. The wind whispered through the grass, and Clara felt a presence not ghostly, but warm, approving. She stayed there until Daniel came to find her. She would have been proud, he said softly, understanding immediately, of what we've built, of her sister. Clara looked up at him in surprise, and he smiled. That's how we think of you, both of you. Mary Elizabeth and Clara are 2 daughters. One we held for 3 days, one we'll hold for a lifetime. Both equally loved. As they walked back to the house together, Clara saw Sarah in the window helping Eleanor with some sewing. Rebecca was reading to Louise. Catherine was writing in a new journal, not of horrors this time, but of hopes. Anne was practicing arithmetic that Clara had been teaching her. The Hayes home for second chances was more than a sanctuary now. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope, proof that ordinary people could stand against injustice and win. More girls would come, Clara knew that. They'd need to expand to organize to fight more battles. But tonight they were all safe, all free, all family. 6 months later, Clara stood before a crowd of nearly 300 people. The occasion was the official opening of the Hayes Foundation for Displaced Youth, funded by donations from across Texas and beyond. The story of their fight against the Blackwoods had spread, inspiring others to take action. Clara, now 16, had been asked to speak. She looked out at the crowd, former residents who'd gone on to marriages and careers. Current residents still healing supporters who believed in their mission, and skeptics who'd come to see what the fuss was about. 2 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, I stood on an auction block with no hope and no future. Today, I stand before you as proof that no circumstances are too dire, no situation too hopeless when good people choose to act. She spoke of Daniel and Eleanor's courage, of Sarah's strength, of every girl who'd found refuge at their ranch. She spoke of the changes in law their case had inspired, of the other sanctuaries opening across Texas. We called it the Hayes Home for Second Chances, Clara said. But I've learned something. It's not about second chances. It's about first chances. For many of us, it was our first chance at safety, at education, at love. Our first chance to be seen as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. In the crowd, she saw Victoria Ashford come from San Antonio, where she now ran a school for disadvantaged girls. Sheriff Coleman was there, his badge polished bright. Mr. Chen stood with other Columbus merchants who'd supported them. Patrick and Margaret beamed with pride. But it was Daniel and Eleanor's faces that made Clara's voice catch with emotion. They stood together, Eleanor's head resting on Daniel's shoulder, both looking at her with such love and pride that she had to pause to compose herself. People ask me if I'm grateful for being rescued, Clara continued. Of course I am. But more than that, I'm grateful for being chosen. Not rescued like a charity case, but chosen as a daughter. Not saved like a victim, but empowered as a survivor. The Hayes family didn't just give me a home, they gave me the tools and courage to help others find theirs. She looked at Sarah, who now helped teach the younger girls to read and write. At Rebecca, who discovered a talent for nursing and was apprenticing with Dr. Morrison. At Catherine, whose meticulous record-keeping had become invaluable to their growing organization. Every girl who comes to us arrives believing she's worthless, damaged beyond redemption. But here's the truth. We teach them a truth. Daniel and Eleanor Hayes taught me, your value isn't determined by what was done to you, it's revealed by what you choose to do next. The applause was thunderous. As Clara stepped down from the platform, she was engulfed by embraces. The girls she lived with, the ones who'd moved on but returned for this day, supporters who'd been moved by her words. But it was the quiet moment afterward that Clara would remember most. As the crowd dispersed and the sun set over the Texas prairie, she stood with her family, all of them the whole sprawling, unconventional, beautiful collection of souls who'd found each other against all odds. Look what you started, Eleanor said to Daniel, gesturing at the groups of girls laughing together, at the supporters planning future fundraisers at the building they'd constructed to house even more residents. I didn't start anything, Daniel replied, his arm around Clara's shoulders. I just made one impulsive decision at an auction. The best impulsive decision, Clara corrected, leaning into his embrace. Though I prefer to think of it as destiny. Destiny? Sarah repeated thoughtfully. I like that. We were all destined to find each other. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them all here. The pain and loss that had preceded it, the struggles they'd overcome, the battles they'd won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more girls to help, more fights to win, more minds to change. But tonight, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her, Clara Hayes knew she was exactly where she belonged. The scared girl on the auction block was gone, replaced by a young woman who'd learned that love wasn't measured in blood or birth, but in choice and commitment, in the decision to stand together against whatever came. The ranch that had once been a refuge for one lost girl had become a beacon of hope for hundreds. And at its heart was a simple truth Clara had learned from Daniel and Eleanor Hayes, that every person deserved dignity, every child deserved love, and sometimes the families we build are stronger than the ones we're born to. As laughter filled the evening air and lanterns were lit against the darkness, Clara made a silent promise to the girl she'd been to marry Elizabeth, who'd never gotten her chance, to every girl still trapped and waiting for rescue. This was just the beginning. The Hayes Home for Second Chances would continue to grow, to fight to offer hope to those who'd forgotten what it looked like. And Clara Hayes, once Sullivan, once nobody would make sure that no girl ever stood on an auction block again, feeling as alone and hopeless as she had that terrible morning in Galveston. She had been bought for $100, but what she'd gained was priceless. A family, a purpose, and the knowledge that one person's courage to do right could change the world, one rescued soul at a time. The Texas moon rose full and bright, blessing the ranch with silver light, and Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that her parents, all four of them, birthed and chosen, would be proud of the woman she'd become and the legacy she was building. She was Clara Hayes, daughter of courage, sister to survivors, and proof that love could triumph over the darkest circumstances.